each other, establishing a culture where our stakeholders feel valued, supported, and have opportunities for personal and professional growth, and supporting an approach of continuous improvement to ensure student outcomes. Collectively, we need to work on behalf of the children we serve and find avenues of agreement so that we can govern the district in an effective manner. There is no acceptable alternative. We will always collaborate in a respectful manner in order to enhance opportunities for each student and staff member. We will not disparage others. Our students will thrive because we will remain committed to supporting the whole child. We hope to engage and empower our students and stakeholders to create a community of lifelong learners. And with that, Superintendent Hyde, I will turn it over to you.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board, staff, and community members. At this time, I'd like to bring Ms. Dodge forward. Ms. Dodge is the Senior Director for Legislative Affairs and Policy. During the last board meeting, unfortunately, because time did not permit, we weren't able to cover a summary of all of this most recent legislative session. So Ms. Dodge is here to walk us through that this morning. Hopefully she's had her coffee because there's a lot of slides.
Is this thing on? Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So am I in control of the?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So this is a pretty comprehensive overview of what happened during the last legislative session, which ended in the middle of March. This is bills and the budget. I'm going to start out with the budget, and I'd just like to point out to you, because you've received a lot of budget information already from finance, what I've presented to you here is the difference between how the budget looked when it passed last year as compared to how it looked when it passed this year. So it is year over year, our Polk County numbers. So first of all, you can see in terms of student counts, we've grown by almost 7,000 students, and our weighted is a growth of almost 8,000 students. The BSA has gone up to $4,587.40, and that's an increase of $214.49, and you're going to see in a little bit why we had such a nice increase this year. Safe Schools, we have $1.2 million extra, and SAI almost $1 million. They're not showing an increase in the amount of turnaround school supplement we got this year, but that will be based on what the number of our schools looks like when we actually get that data. And then reading, there was $1.6 million increase. ESE, you can see there was a nice increase for once. And transportation is another area where we saw a significant increase, and that's again tied to the $15 minimum wage requirement that I'm going to talk to in just a minute. Instructional materials was a slight increase, and then so was the teacher supply allocation. The teacher supply allocation is kind of weird because of the great increase that we've had in students, but we'll see how that ends up shaking out. They did eliminate the digital classrooms allocation, so that was technology money, and the thinking was that the districts have received so much technology money from the federal governments and ESSER, ESSER 2, and ARP that maybe that wasn't something that the state needed to focus on this year, and they could focus their dollars elsewhere. And then class size reduction went up by almost little over $4 million. However, you're going to see on an upcoming slide that they actually are giving us less per student for class size reduction, but there's more students. So our total potential funds increase was over $91.6 million year over year in total. So our funds per student is now almost, we were told that it was going to be about $8,000 per student next year. We're at $7,900. That's an increase of $352.38, but that has mostly to do with our property values and our DCD. And then total local funds increase was almost $22 million, state $70 million. You can see on these next few lines, we get over $4 million just from the compression of our .748 mills, which is local funding based on our property values. The lottery school recognition was funded this year. It was funded at $200 million, and you'll see some language coming up in that, and that will be based on the number of A and B schools and schools that increase their grade by at least one grade level. RLE for us went up $17 million, and that's starting to show the growth that we're seeing in Polk County, but it's not anywhere near the realization that we'll probably see next year. Teacher salary increase was $9.7 million, and mental health allocation was $866,000 increase. Funding compression and hold harmless was a little more than what we received last year. That's a line item that we have to fight for every year that brings us towards the average per student, but not to the average per student of the state. And then our base FEFP was increased $56 million. So let's talk about the minimum wage. In the budget proviso, it says in order to qualify for all of the state money, which is in those appropriation numbers that you see there, we have to guarantee that we're going to pay every school district employee at least $15 per hour by October 1, 2022, and the superintendent has to attest to that under penalty of perjury to the Department of Education. So if an employee by January of next year is not receiving at least $15 an hour, they can basically sue us. They have a cause for civil action. So some of the things that are important in there are, in addition to the fact that this is a requirement and we don't qualify to receive money if we don't do it, plus we can get sued, is the fact that it only applies to school district employees, and it only the superintendent has to attest to the fact that that we have complied with that. It doesn't apply to charter schools. They still benefit from the increases that we've seen in all those line items, but they don't have to meet that requirement in order to receive the money, and they don't have to attest that they are meeting it. The teacher salary increase allocation, it went up $200 million this year, and they changed the allocation, so instead of an 80-20 split between putting the money towards the 47.5 for first-year teachers and the veteran teachers on the salary schedule, it's now half and half. So we have to take the first half of our increase in the allocation and put it towards getting everyone on the to the minimum of 47.5 for their salary, and then the other 50% can be used in accordance with the statute, and the statute says that's for your veteran teachers, your teachers who aren't considered quote-unquote classroom teachers, and everyone else on the salary on that salary schedule. Changes to ESSER and ARP, we've probably already heard some rumblings about that. There was a little skirmish last month because the department came back to us and asked us to submit everything we had for our non-enrollment and our learning loss money, because that money is going to revert and be reappropriated for the summer learning camps this summer. And so even though the budget hasn't been signed, the department was preparing for that and requiring the districts to resubmit their plans to make sure that they were in compliance when the budget does get signed. All of that money reverts back to the state and then is reappropriated for the summer learning camps. And then for VPK programs, you'll see there was a nice increase for the first time in the school year BSA by a little over $300, and the summer BSA by almost $300. And then there is an additional $100 million that the state put into the VPK program so that any provider or public school is going to attest and confirm that within 30 days of receiving their funding from that allocation, all of the personnel in the VPK programs are being paid $15 per hour. Capital outlay, you'll see that public schools received $11 million. That all went to one school district based on the high growth district capital outlay assistance grant. How we didn't qualify that, we don't know, but we're investigating that because we fully expect to qualify for it next year. And then charter schools received $195 million, and that's the money they receive from the state so that we do not, under statute, have to share our 1.5 mils capital outlay millage with the charter schools. If the state hadn't funded that, we would have to do that. School hardening, there's $20 million in school hardening grants in the budget for next year, and that's for unmet school campus hardening needs. And there's a report that's going to be required that we have to outline what our needs are by district and by charter school. So now we're into the bills. Before I start going over all the fun and exciting bills that were passed this year, does anybody have any questions about the budget? Great, that means I did an excellent job, and I'm very proud of myself. So, HB1 is the additional homestead exemption for critical public service workers. That is going to go to our teachers and other folks who during the pandemic were considered critical public service workforce. It will go on the ballot in November, and the electorate will have to, at least 60% of the people will have to vote for that, for the teachers to get that additional homestead exemption. Classroom teacher is not defined in the bill, so that will be defined if and when it gets passed in November. But that will be on the ballot in November, and it's an additional homestead exemption that for us would include teachers and maybe some of our law enforcement officers. HB 7 is individual freedom. This is one of what everybody's referring to the sevens. There were 3 bills that were slightly controversial that passed during the session that all either started or ended in 7. So this prohibits instruction on training on topics around people being inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, one race being superior to another, discrimination on any of the federally protected areas. So it also prohibits instruction or training that individuals bear responsibility for the actions of others of the same race or sex. And it prohibits a person to be instructed to feel guilt or anguish for actions committed by others in the past by the same race or sex. If an employer requires instruction or sworn belief in the barred topics, it's defined as an unfair labor practice, and we would be able to be sued. This is going to be a trend you're going to be hearing throughout the rest of my presentation. Basically, we can be sued for anything nowadays. I'm just going to flat out say it. The above banned topics also cannot be a condition of employment or the training thereof. And then teaching of topics that are covered by the Florida Standards of History are specifically noted and can be taught as long as the banned concept aren't included. So all of these prohibitions are not only going to impact our classrooms as to what we can teach in our classrooms, but they're also going to impact the district in terms of what we can have in our employee training programs. HB 173, care of students with epilepsy. If a student has a ISAP, which is something you get from a doctor, they would bring it to the school district, and it would be our responsibility to make sure that we're familiar with that plan and that somebody is responsible at the school to make sure that plan is implemented for the student. That has already been signed by the governor, and so it's effective July 1, 2022. Children with developmental delays, this extends the benefits of the program for students until age 9 or completion of grade 2. Right now, it stops when they begin school at the age of 5, and that has also been signed by the governor already. 1054, financial literacy. Right now, financial literacy is what's the word I'm looking for? An elective. Thank you, an elective class that students can take, and it will once again become a requirement for students who enter 9th grade in the 23-24 school year. It's going to be a half credit, and the state is going to have to come up with standards for that course. And the required electives to graduate from high school have been reduced from 8 to 7.5. Again, Yes, ma'am?
I want to go back to 173. Don't we already do that? At least every school I was at that I had kids, we did.
We probably were, but now it is required
Okay.
that we do it. I think we've been.
So somebody has to actually physically sign off that they were trained? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Somebody at the school has to be trained on what's in the student's plan.
Well, I read it to be every teacher that child has to be trained. Because they
Every
could-
employee who comes in regular
There you go.
contact with the student has to have the training.
So the teacher will have to sign off they've been trained.
I
Yeah,
mean,
that's
they're
my
going to have
point.
to be trained and then sign off.
That's
that
what I
they've
mean.
been trained. Okay, I didn't want to just make it sound
And
like
if
it
there's
was
a
a
schedule
sign-off.
change, that has to be followed up, and, okay.
Charter school charters, this is kind of based on something that happened last year in another school district, but basically it says that the charter statute has been modified so that a charter can be modified during any term, not just the first term, to reference it can just be changed instead of just saying the initial term or renewal. They can change a charter contract at any time. It requires that the modification be approved or denied within 60 days, and that the sponsor notify the governing board of any denial within 10 days and the specific reasons. And then the causes for non-renewal and termination section of the statute were changed so that a governing board has to be notified at least 90 days before the end of the school year, and before a board vote of any renewal, termination, or non-renewal, and then an automatic renewal is going to happen if they're not notified at least 90 days before the end of the school year. So those are changes in the timeline that impact when we can do our renewals and what happens, it's what happens if we would like to non-renew or terminate a school. That, it says it hasn't been presented, but actually since this it was actually signed by the governor last week, so that is law now, HB 225. HB 461 is the Bright Future Service requirements that allows students to be paid for their volunteer hours to qualify for Bright Futures. And then school concurrency could have been a lot worse than it ended up. It started out as a pretty bad bill, but it ended up just being that school concurrency is satisfied when the developer gives us a written legally binding commitment to provide proportionate mitigation. We have to notify the local government that capacity is available after receiving that within 30 days, and that any mitigation paid by a developer has to be set aside and not spent until the appropriate improvement is identified. And that also was signed last week. SB 758 is a lot. These are charter school and some other changes that were made. The first thing is they gave members of the legislature in this bill the same visitation rights that school board members have, so they can just show up to a school without notice and visit. It creates the Charter School Review Commission to approve applications, and they would just notify the school district that someone from your district has applied to the state to be a charter. And then we would have we would have a certain amount of time in which to provide input on that application. And then it basically says that the state notifies us, hey, we've approved a charter and you have to contract with them now. That is subject to legislative appropriation. There was nothing in the budget to fund this Charter School Review Commission. However, there are some other funds that the state set up, including what did they call it? They called it the Biden Fund, but it was actually a inflation fund that they set up that has $1 billion in it that lets a department, such as the Department of Education, apply for additional funds. So it's, even though it wasn't funded in the budget, it might still be able to get going. Yes, ma'am?
Question about this one, but it's to the superintendent. Have we discussed the process here? Because what will happen if a school's approved that hasn't gone through our vetting process? I just want to make sure that we have a process in place to review their budgets and what they're doing. Like, I think we need to keep a closer eye on ones that haven't came through our committee.
I'm not sure what you're asking. We
So
do have
it-
a process in place where we review their financials.
Is our staff, is there anything extra we're going to add to these districts, these charter schools that come into our district that we have not vetted? Is it going to be the same process, or is it something more accountability measures through our office?
Well, there's no accountability. I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. You're talking about a new charter school that wants to establish itself in Polk County. They must follow the traditional process in their application. They must fully delineate their curriculum, their supports, their finances, how they're going to maintain their finances. And so there's a review process there. During the renewal process, following the initial terms of their contract, we do, again, go back through and verify their financial status and everything else. But you used the word accountability, and there's no accountability for a new charter other than the application process itself. So maybe I'm not understanding the question.
So there won't be any review until to the renewal of their budget and/or,
No, a review can actually be triggered at any time, but that's triggered based off of known information. For example, should a charter school see a significant decline in their academic performance, or should we become aware of a financial issue at a charter school, then yes, we can request an audit at that time as part of their contract, because we have the authority to review and potentially either revoke their contract or require corrective action. But that would be information that we would address in real time as we became aware of issues.
thank you.
And so I also believe that a first-year charter, we receive financials monthly, whereas in more established charters, we're only allowed to ask for that type of information quarterly. So for these particular schools, because they would be new to us, a brand-new contract, we would still get that information monthly until they were more established. And then you're going to see on the next bullet here, we're not allowed now to ask for any additional reporting requirements from a charter school unless they're in a state of financial emergency or deteriorating financial condition, which is outlined in statute, what that looks like. So even if we wanted to do that, we are now, in this bill, which was signed last week, prohibited from having any additional requirements for these schools.
Ms. Fields?
So what is and what was the purpose of creating the Charter School Review Commission? It just doesn't add up to me. There were no appropriations allocated. So is this an extra tool for them to have? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Do you have any thoughts on that? Any views from other folks or what?
So many, many years ago, the charter schools have always wanted an alternate authorizer. They don't, there are just some, including mostly, this is a view from the management company type of charter schools, that they don't always get fair treatment or a fair shake from the school districts. And so they have forever wanted an alternate authorizer. I'm not sure if you remember, it was probably before you were even on the board. That's how long I've been around. There was actually an alternate authorizer that was passed in law many years ago. We put some provisions in there that said if you're a good school district that treats your charter schools right, then you're not subject to this alternate authorizer. And for many years, Polk County was the only district that met those standards. And then that alternate authorizer was struck down by the Supreme Court, and it was never appealed. And so the charter segment has wanted an alternate authorizer for a long time. They've tried to put it on the ballot. They've done a lot of things. They believe that, and in all fairness, and it's not outrageous or uncommon in other states to have an alternate authorizer. We already really have it in Florida. Universities can authorize, community colleges can authorize. So this is an additional authorizer. What is uncommon about this structure is the fact that the state is going to approve these schools and then hand them off to the school board to monitor and watch. In any other state where there's an alternate authorizer, whoever approves that application is the sponsor, and they monitor the financials and the accountability of the academic program and those types of things.
So Ms. Miller, this may go back to your question, if it's aligned. If the Charter School Review Commission were to approve a charter, we must implement and support the charter. We then, the only accountability measures we would have in place, as Ms. Dodge and I shared a few moments ago, would be whatever required reporting currently exists so that we can continue to monitor the school and its performance. Even then, I have a strong sense that should we move to revoke a charter school due to underperformance or financial insolvency, that there would be an appeal process that goes back through the Charter Review Commission. This, by and large, it largely erodes local control. It is what it is. And so I know And Ms. Fields, this may get back to your question about what are we hearing. The reality of this is it really is eroding local control. And if this is what's going to happen, then why not have the Charter School Review Commission just basically become the owner-operator as well in the management group? Why pass that burden on to the school district, essentially as a pass-through, for us to assume those responsibilities? And yet, at the end of the day, it readily appears that we have little to no authority any further as it relates to regulation and or monitoring. So it is frustrating, but we're not the only state. Again, my previous state, much as Ms. Dodge just shared, the Charter Review Commission, I believe, because we were in a situation locally where we were going to revoke a charter, and we knew that they would appeal to the Charter School Review Commission. They had a 100% pass rate on all appeals for multiple years. And so we were just going to bypass the Charter Review Commission. We were already hiring attorneys to litigate the issue outside of that, because that was still a viable option for us, because we knew the history of the Charter Review Commission. And so I think we'll have to wait and see how this Charter Review Commission operates, but it is very much an erosion of local control. That is what this is, so.
Well, another thing that it does is the playing field continues to be uneven and unbalanced, which is unfortunate.
As Ms. Dodge said, they're going to get the benefit of additional weighted funding that was solely intended to increase the hourly rates of pay for employees, and yet they're under no obligation to ensure that that rate of pay is being met. So there is a lot of flexibility that they receive that fortunately or unfortunately, if we had the same operating flexibility, I think we would continue to show that public schools would outperform. So.
Again, I'm always happy to bring lots of good news to you guys.
Ms. Miller.
I just, I think this was designed for the management companies, but we've seen others come in that we've had the review of, and they'll pull their application when they see our results from the review because it's just so egregious. And so I'm hoping that the state has similar requirements so we're not having to double our work holding schools accountable for minimal compliance issues. Some of these schools that have came through, I was shocked to read the applications. And then our review committee has been so good about sharing the concerns, and we haven't had them here. So I guess to open the door to just anyone is concerning, but that's all.
So I'm not saying that this is what happened, but in a district like Polk where we don't have a lot of management company schools, because of kind of what you've said, we have a very careful and thoughtful and well-held up review process. This would be a way for a management company to come into a district like that if they were to go to the state instead of the school district. And then the other thing, I didn't put the entire process in because you're going to see we're like only on the third bullet of this bill, which is really long. But there's also a requirement that the state contract with a college or university to help them with their review, which is kind of weird because that's not where the expertise lies in this state. But that's what's going to happen. Hopefully they would do something with a college or university outside of Florida that has expertise in this area. So continuing on with this lovely bill, it voids as unenforceable any ordinance that adds extra regulatory burden for a charter school unless it's already allowed somewhere else in law. It allows interlocal agreements that we have to be used by a charter school. And it automatically grants a 5-year renewal to a charter school that has been given a grade of C or less, unless it's the third C that they've received, because that triggers some turnaround language. And then it automatically grants a 15-year charter to those whose most recent grade was an A or B if they're not in a state of financial emergency or deteriorating financial condition. So if you have a school that is a C and you're worried about the trending data, there have been times when we would go back and say, we're going to give you 3 years and a 3-year contract and just see how you're doing and see if your trend changes. We would no longer be allowed to do that. So, and then it also modifies the qualifications for a termination or non-renewal and puts some language in there about how it has to be the grounds have to be expressly found, and that's probably a question for John Murphy as to what the difference is between grounds and expressly found, but that's what they changed it to.
Generally speaking, when you have a statute that says expressly, that's exactly what it means, is that it has to be something that you find that's specific, and that's, you have to track the language in the statute. And so you can't infer, perhaps, or you can't assume or imply other things. You have to be express as to how you would view it. So it does, I would suggest to you that that is a higher burden, perhaps, than what you may currently have.
Thank you. And then they also remove, it used to be that you could non-renew or terminate for financial, academic reasons or other good cause shown, such as breaking the law or something like that, and they removed the opportunity to do that for other good cause shown. It prohibits a charter school from being subject to land use regulations to which a traditional public school wouldn't have to follow. They can use any facility or land owned by a college, university, or similar public institution. I'm not sure what would be similar, but if it's similar, they can use it. Or any facility previously housing a school or a licensed child care facility. They require us to share a proportional share of impact fees to be designated to them if it's a development that was built specifically to mitigate impact of an increased dwelling and a charter school is going to serve it. It prohibits teacher salary funding from being calculated in their administrative fee. And that, as you saw, that was a big increase this year to $850 million. And so that will impact, we have to do a lot of work in order to get that teacher salary money out to the charter schools, but we will not be able to recoup that in our administrative fee. It creates the Florida Charter School Institute, the Institute for Charter School Innovation at Miami-Dade College for the purpose of improving charter school authorizing practices. That was also subject to appropriation and not funded in the budget, but we'll see what happens. This is probably the biggie right here. It requires an OPAGA study of the current methodologies for distribution of capital outlay and federal funding to charter schools. And OPAGA is going to make recommendations for equitable distribution of all this funding to charter schools. And then it also, the last thing is it requires us to distribute the teacher salary allocation money to the charter schools that have submitted their plan to us, regardless of whether we've received that funding from the state or not, based on where our plan is in the process. So any other, yes, ma'am?
Does their plan have to be approved before we give them the money, or they just have to submit it to us?
I believe that they just submit it to us. Does anybody know any different over there?
The current process is we have to submit their plan to DOE, and then DOE has to approve it before we're authorized to release the funding. Based on the changes Wendy mentioned, we can verify that that's still the process, but that's what we've done thus far.
Okay. I just want to make sure that they have to be approved before we give them the money, that they can't submit us some, because I know we've had issues in the past with a couple schools not submitting something that aligned to what it legally has to be. So
Yes.
if we could verify that process, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
I think we're probably waiting for guidance from the department on that. Any other questions before I move on to something more fun, like tax referenda? 777 is local tax referenda, and that says that if we are going to do a millage, it has to be held at a general election. That is effective October of this year, because there were some school districts out there that already had plans for putting something on the ballot at the in August, and so in order to accommodate, because it takes so much to work to get there, the legislature moved the effective date for that. Educator certification pathways for veterans. Let's say a veteran get a temporary certificate. If they're active duty with at least 48 months, honorable discharge or medical separation, and at least 60 college credits towards a bachelor's or higher with a 2.5 GPA. So a lot of requirements to get it, but it's there. And they don't have to qualify for a waiver of the GK, and they get their fees waived if they were honorably just discharged for all those tests, and that is effective July 1. I don't know why I did that twice, but you can ignore the second one. Mental health of students, we have to designate a mental health coordinator now to serve as a primary point of contact for coordination of anything regarding a student, if we're going to be doing anything regarding our policies towards mental health. Charter schools have to comply with the voluntary examination statute, which was passed the last 2 years, and it requires DOE to share with us their data on our data to DCF. Does that make sense? The data that we're reporting on involuntary examinations has to be reported by the state to DCF. And then when we modify our plans, it has to include timelines for student assessment and receipt of services and ensure that notifications to parents is happening and others in the home of services being provided. That has not been signed. Or no, I'm sorry, that was signed last week. 1048 is student assessments. Beginning the next school year, we're using the progress monitoring 3 times a year for ELA in grades 3 to 10, and for math in grades 3 to 8. It's going to be administered at the beginning, middle, and end of the school year. The results have to be to a teacher within a week and parents within 2 weeks in an easy-to-understand report. They delete all the requirements for paper-based testing. And then the end-of-year assessment, that third assessment of progress monitoring, is going to be what we now consider to be the state test it's going to replace the FSA, and the results for that have to be available no later than May 31st, which is today. So today, next year, we were going to have all of our data on testing for students. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Is there anything written in here about, for lack of a better word, VAM scores or anything that comes down to actually be punitive for teachers and schools within this bill? Or are they just going to hold us harmless for a year until they get the baseline data?
Yeah, the second thing. So
Okay.
everything's being held harmless the first year because there's not going to be any student learning gains available, because it's the first year of a new test, and every time we move from FCAT to FCAT 2.0, they
Right.
always do that. So there's not going to be any grades, there's not going to be anything that first year because there's no learning gains, and then they will set grades at,
23, 24.
yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
I just want everybody to be ready.
So by January of each year, they have to publish the dates for the next 2 years. And then after the first 2 years, they're going to have a feasibility and validity study. And the commissioner will have to make recommendations on, is this working out? Do we need to make some changes? It requires school districts to secure parental consent if we're going to exceed the 5% test administration. So if we're adding additional, say, any sort of testing or additional progress monitoring that would exceed that 5% cap, we would have to get parental permission. We have to provide the students' results within a week of administration. The 22-23 school year grades will serve as a baseline for determining the cut scores on the new assessment, and same percentage of each grade will be issued. And that's because of the no learning gains. And then no one who is in will enter turnaround based on that first administration, but you can exit.
So go back a slide there, Ms. Dodge, if you would.
Okay.
So a couple issues with this in particular. We are well within the 5%. However, we do have some concerns that in the absence of the parent company that the state is migrating their assessment platform to, we've reached out to them to ask if they provide a progress monitoring tool similar to what we use now in our elementary schools, so that we can provide our teachers with regular ongoing feedback, and more importantly, be more explicit in how we align interventions and supports and lessons for our students based off their individual skill deficiencies. The parent company does not do that. They, however, have indicated to me that they have a subsidiary company, and we're waiting to hear from them. The reason I bring that up is, should we find that they don't, then we may find ourselves in a position that we continue to test So we could be close to that 5% threshold, although the assessment accountability officers assured me we won't reach that threshold. But it is important for us to maintain our ongoing progress monitoring. Also, in this in particular, I want to point out the second bullet from the bottom, the fact that the same percentage of grades will be issued. That is incredibly troubling. The reality of the assessment is that when we just assume that we're going to, our best guess as far as how we're going to disperse grades is to say, well, if there were 30% of our schools last year were A's, then we're only going to allow 30% of schools this year to be an A. I don't, under any circumstances, can I understand or fathom how they arrived at that decision. We advocated very aggressively throughout the process with both bill sponsors to try and get that modified to say that they would assign the same percentage minimally to allow additional schools. So if you imagine, let's just imagine the worst case scenario, 30% of our schools are an A, and all those schools score the same number of total points. Let's just say it's 350 points, and I know it's a double-digit score now, but let's say that there's actually 20 more schools new to the list that had the exact same score that would qualify them for an A last year. They won't get in this year because it's just 30% of the schools that can be issued an A, not necessarily those who earned enough points to be an A. And that's incredibly troubling because the hope would be that under a new assessment, especially an assessment like this, we should see a continuum of improvement and we should see more schools move from D's to C's, C's to B's, B's to A's. And to be capped by a percentage seems a little bit ridiculous. Seems a lot ridiculous to me. And it's something we fought very aggressively for. But I wanted that noted on the record that the percentage of grades is locked in and they were not allowed to be issued more than those that would qualify. And we specifically asked, what are you going to do when you get to the bottom of the list and 15 schools tied with the same score? We got no answer as to who would make it into the 30 percentile. So it'll be interesting to see how they address that issue this year in particular. So, Ms. Fields.
My questions were similar to your explanation, but this is supposed to be implemented this upcoming school year. And so my question is, when will the tool be released? And how will we train staff? And when will the first monitoring be? And I think you pretty much answered that we would still use our monitoring tools that we have in place. It's unfortunate that we can't use our tool and not have to implement the assessment that they have put in place.
Yes, so we won't receive data or any additional updates from the state until June. We have asked repeatedly, superintendents, FADS has asked repeatedly, and we were told that in June, more information would be released. So right now, we're all very much in limbo asking the same questions you just asked because we know the importance of getting the information before our teachers. And there's a lot of unanswered questions that even the department shared with us. There's been some conversation that should a student pass the first baseline assessment with an acceptable score that would show that they're on grade level, there's questions as to whether or not they have to take the other two progress monitoring assessments because they've already demonstrated they're at grade level. So it's an interesting issue that we're facing right now, but there's a lot of uncertainty and all of us are waiting anxiously to get this information so that we can disseminate it to our staff because they're the ones at the end of the day who need to best implement and direct instruction towards ensuring we're meeting those grade level standards. So as soon as we get it, we'll share that with the board. We'll share it with all of our staff, especially with our administrators and our teachers. But as of this date, I believe Mr. McNaughton and others will share. At the earliest, we're expecting a mid-June update from the state.
So this will impact our PD for staff when they are coming back from summer.
Significantly. Also, one of the reasons, and again, very appreciative of the board to have approved that for the extra early release days that we added to the calendar for the sole purpose of providing training on our one-to-one deployment and on the new assessment platform and best standards at the elementary school level.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
HB 1421 is school safety. It requires us to adopt a plan guiding family reunification when there's a natural or man-made disaster. and that is to include not only students but staff. It requires the State Board of Education to adopt a rule setting requirements for emergency drills, including the timing and everything, so that right now, we're following federal standards, and there's been a lot of drills. And so in order to kind of get a handle on that, the State Board's going to set rules as to how many of each kind of drill that you have to do. Law enforcement is responsible for responding to schools in the event of emergency. Law enforcement who are responsible for responding in the event of emergency have to be present when we do those drills. It requires the school safety and environment reporting data, which is your SESR data, to be published in a uniform statewide format that's easy to read and understand. I wish them the best of luck on that. It requires all safe school officers, not just the resource officer, to complete the mental health crisis intervention training, and the school district and local mobile response teams have to use the same suicide screening tool that has been approved by the Department of Education. It reinforces the oversight and sanctioning authority of the commissioner to oversee school safety and security compliance. So that's the withholding salaries if we're not complying and that kind of language. And it also extends the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Safety Commission until July 1 of 2026. That was supposed to sunset this year. Any questions about school safety? HB 1467 is an overall education bill. Most important to you, it limits term limits for school board members to 12 years beginning November of this year. So anything you've already served doesn't count towards that 12. It's prospective. Meetings of committees held to rank, eliminate, or select instructional materials have to be noticed and open to the public and must include parents of district students on such committees, just like we did. Beginning 2023, school librarians, media specialists, and other personnel have to have DOE training in order to serve in that capacity. Any book available in the Library Media Center or part of a reading list has to be selected by a certified media specialist. I want to clarify, because there's been a lot of language about this. It's not that every school has to have a certified media specialist to do the selection, but that's who has to do the selection. So we can share positions, we can work it out however we'd like to, but that's the employee that has to make those choices. School boards have to adopt procedures for developing library media collections and post them on our website. Each elementary school has to publish a list of all their library media materials or required reading on the school website in a searchable format. We have to publish a list of all instructional materials on our website in a searchable format, and I think a lot of this we are way ahead of the curve on. Beginning June of next year, we have to submit a list to the commissioner of all materials that have been objected to, what we removed or discontinued, and then the state is going to share that with all the other school districts, just in case they'd like to do the same thing. Bless you. And then they're going to, by July 1, annually, each year, the superintendent has to certify that all librarians and media specialists have completed that training that's required. 1557, the last of the sevens, is parental rights. The board has to adopt procedures for notifying a student's parents if there's a change in services related to mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being. We are prohibited from adopting procedures or student support forms that prohibit personnel from notifying parents about anything about a student's well-being. We are discouraged or prohibited, wait a minute, I'm not saying that right. We are discouraged from prohibiting parental notification or involvement in any decision they don't want us not notifying parents about anything. I don't think I wrote that out right, but you know what I mean. Classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity is prohibited in grades K to 3, and it must be age appropriate in other grades. At the beginning of the school year, we have to notify parents of any healthcare services offered at that school, at each school, and then afford them the opportunity to withhold consent or decline services. This, I think, is going to be the most challenging because we have so many schools that offer so many different things, and we don't always know who's coming in until they tell us. We have to provide the parent of students in grades K to 3 copies of questionnaires or health screening forms and obtain their permission prior to administering those forms. And then if a concern for a parent regarding any of the requirements or procedures above is not resolved, they can request the appointment of a special magistrate, or they can sue the school district and obtain a declaratory judgment. And then it requires the school district to adopt policies to notify parents of all these procedures. So expect to see some more policy updates coming. 2524. This bill was 235 pages. I'm sorry, ma'am.
Ms. Fields.
So my question is primarily to the superintendent. So with all of these new requirements, and with all of the work that we currently have before our staff, how are we going to ensure that all these things get done? Are we going to have to hire additional staff to do that? Are we going to put that extra burden on our current employees?
So for many of these, we actually have policies and procedures already in place. Ms. Dodge highlighted one in particular when we talk about the fact at the beginning of the school year, the school district must notify parents of health care services offered at their child's school and the option to withhold consent or decline any specific service. We already do that. So even in the case of Hazel, it's an opt-in, not an opt-out. And in the case of other support services or community-based services, for example, at our community-based schools, all of those things are already well documented for families. So that information would go home at the beginning of the school year. A lot of this is just communication protocol, putting it on our website, making sure parents are well informed, and making sure we're proactive. The only place in here where we're going to find ourselves in jeopardy, and so specifically to your question, no, I do not believe that this creates an additional burden for staff, because again, much of this is already addressed as part of our ongoing policies and procedures here in Polk County, thankfully. The only place where I believe we're going to find ourselves, and this was not addressed here in the slide deck, is that we are prohibited from establishing procedures that would keep information from a parent unless the child's in jeopardy. And that's going to be the most difficult aspect of this, is how do we best define that for staff so they can make an informed decision as to the health and well-being of that student when he or she, or we have an indication that should that child's information be shared, that it would create physical abuse or result in homelessness or those types of issues. And so that's where we're going to have to be very careful. But the law very explicitly says you cannot not prevent, or excuse me, you cannot prohibit the sharing of information with parents, but it does go on to say unless that student's going to be in jeopardy. And so, and I'm paraphrasing it, this is much more lengthy paragraph that's attached. So for the other areas, for example, Ms. Fields, to your question as well, we summarized and created an Excel spreadsheet that captured all the bills, regardless of their signature, with the understanding that by the end of June, all of our policies and procedures would be written and established and ready to go. So we've already been working on this. Staff have been working on this for several months once we were in session, because we knew that there would be requirements. Now, some, of course, don't take effect until 2023, 24, such as the financial literacy course, but that was something we were already working on anyways. We've been talking about a half-credit life skills course that would include financial literacy. So there'll be other components that we incorporate into that class as well that would serve our students well. So a lot of this work has already begun. The media specialists and staff, the requirements placed upon them are requirements they already have. They are currently responsible for the selection of those material and purchases for their libraries. Well, the only place in here that I found interesting was that they are now required to also approve reading lists, and we have to get some further clarification from the department. Are those reading lists that they're producing from the school library, or those reading lists that our ELA or social studies teachers are developing to supplement their class? I don't know that that's the role of the media specialist, but we'll get some clarification on that.
And what about the Florida DOE training for the media specialists? Anybody have any idea on what that's going to entail?
No, ma'am. We have heard little to nothing about that, other than it's coming, because they know they have an obligation and a deadline to hit themselves. But that training I would be surprised if it's anything but virtual at this time, considering the number of individuals they have to roll this out to, and the manner in which they'll support school districts. And so what we would have to do is find some time during teacher in-service pre-planning before students return. We'll have to work with our building leaders and PEA and others to carve out some time for them to complete that training prior to the start of the school year.
Well, that's in 2023, so there's time for
Okay.
that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Ms. Dodge.
So the next bill is 2524. This was an education conforming bill. It was 235 pages, and I'm going to be very honest with you, this is a up in the clouds, not every detail of the bill summary, because it was really long and it hit a lot of areas. So K-12 virtual, it requires all virtual full-time students to be funded in the FEFP in the same manner as any other student. Out-of-district virtual FTE students are funded with FEFP only and not local dollars, and are limited to 50%. If we're taking in students from outside of the district, we can't have more than 50% of our current FTE for virtual students in the district. And then DOE has to develop a standard virtual charter school contract. It requires us to post our controlled open enrollment process on our website, which we already do, maintain a wait list, which we already do, and maintain capacity by grade level and update it every 2 weeks, which we don't already do. So that's the change for us. Increasing the amount of transportation scholarship for public schools based on what they spend. So right now, the transportation scholarship in statute is $750, and so if we as a district spend more than $750 per student transporting student, which Rob has told me that's about what we spend right now, it would increase the value of the transportation scholarship for a student. It changes student literacy. They establish a micro-credential for reading that enables teachers to provide evidence-based reading interventions. There are financial incentives for teachers to earn this, and then we're allowed to spend our reading allocation money on those expenditures. So, So under the turnaround language, it allows us to contract with additional entities. And then in reviewing the school grading scale, they put language in there that said if there's any grade band, such as elementary, middle school, high school, K-8, that has more than 70% of the schools in that grade band receiving A's and B's, then that's going to trigger an automatic increase to the school grading scale. Very popular. DOE is going to.
I'm sorry, just so I'm on the record, that's been policy forever, though. Ever since letter grades were implemented, there was the knowledge that should a percentile exceed an acceptable bandwidth, that they would ratchet up the expectation and change the scale score cutoff to ensure that not too many schools were scoring within certain areas. So,
Current statute actually only applies to high schools,
Okay.
which is why they extended it to all grade bands under this. And then DOE is going to annually collect until 2025 data on the amount of instructional time spent on assessments and report those findings to the governor and legislature. The decision to withhold information from a parent related to his or her child's well-being has to be documented and redetermined annually. Teacher evaluation procedures are not subject to collective bargaining. Specifically in this bill, personnel not on the performance salary schedule have to receive raises higher than those that are. Educational entities have to use the ACA background screening clearinghouse now to conduct all background screenings. And that requirement starts January 1st of 2024, or when ACA is prepared, because every entity, not just us, but childcare providers, everyone in the state now has to do all their background screening through that clearinghouse. It establishes a criminal penalty for anyone who knowingly fails to report sexual misconduct by a school authority figure. It provides flexibility with the reading allocation by saying we no longer have to have that additional hour of reading at the lowest 300 schools in reading. And then it expands the ability for us to use vehicles other than buses to transport students and creates a driving choice grant program, which is a $15 million program that school districts and other entities can apply for if they would like to get vehicles or other opportunities for transporting students to choice programs. And then the Unique Ability Florida Empowerment Scholarship is going to grow by 26,500 students, and then the growth rate was supposed to be a 1% per year annual growth rate, and that has been moved to the 23-24 school year. So there was a lot more stuff in that bill, but if you've heard about anything that you have questions about, please feel free to contact me, but it was rather lengthy and, as you can see, all over the place in terms of subjects. 7071 is a tax bill. It establishes a 2-week back-to-school sales tax holiday for clothing, school supplies, learning aids, computers, and that's going to be from July 25th to August 7th. That's longer than we usually have for back-to-school tax holiday. We are currently in the middle of a 3-month sales tax exemption for children's books. Yes, ma'am?
Oh, sorry, you can finish, but at the end of this, I have a question.
Okay. Children's books sales tax holiday goes from May 14th to August 14th. Capital outlay surtax can be used to purchase, lease, or lease purchase school buses if it was originally included in the referendum. And then it allows an additional $25 per student to be transferred from our 1.5 mils to pay for vehicles and increase insurance costs. That's the legislature acknowledging that our property insurance costs have also increased and allowing us to transfer additional funds into operating to pay for it. That was already signed by the governor. Mrs. Wyatt?
There's several tax holidays that were added this year. Have we done any type of assessment as to how that's going to affect our half-cent sales tax? I figure a month of nobody paying tax on gas for that will hit us a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Do we have the ability, anyone?
Okay,
Yeah.
so. we'll just
They
see.
don't even put any estimates in the staff analysis for us.
Okay.
So there's just no, like on the FRS bills, they at least tell you, this is how it's going to impact you. They just don't even
We
do
can
that.
certainly track it for the month and then use that and compare it back again to prior years' tax base, tax revenue, and then allow Ms. Dodge to use that for advocacy moving forward, that please understand the impact that this has.
I was just curious as far, it's how it would affect us, because just seems to be a lot more this year than previously.
It may
as
be
far as the
something
sales
Mr.
tax
Pitts has to
holidays.
work with the county on to kind of get a sense of how much fuel was sold and how the sales tax revenue impacted overall revenue. But yeah,
I just want to make sure we know how to prepare for it.
yes, ma'am.
HB 5007 was the FRS bill. It increases allocation to investment plan members by 3% for each member, and then modifies drops so that special risk class, who are law enforcement officers, can participate and drop for 36 extra months or 3 extra years. And then there's a 156.3 statewide increase in the rates for school districts. So when you consider we're about 4% of the student population, that's 4%, about 4. And I think Heather has already given you much better numbers than that, but that's about the impact to our school district, and that is effective July 1st, 2022. The implementing bill is where that school recognition language that I talked about earlier during the budget, there's $200 million for school recognition. It goes to school districts who put parents first and complied with the emergency rules regarding face coverings that were in place at the beginning of the school year. All public schools that received a school grade and were not found in violation of the rule can participate in that program. It extends for, and so we're unsure how that's going to be implemented, because it was school boards that actually were in violation of the rules and not schools, but the language specifically says schools who were not found in violation. And so that's going to be interesting to see how it's implemented. Another interesting thing about that is that the last time we had school recognition funding was the last year we received school grades, but it was only about $124 million. And so this year, it's $200 million, and 13 of the biggest school districts in Florida may not be able to participate. So the amount that will be available to the schools that do qualify, and again, that's if your school gets an A or B grade or jumped up at least one grade, there may be a significant amount of money available to those schools for bonuses, et cetera. It extends for 1 year the authorization to provide a funding, the funding compression that we greatly benefit from. It provides that this year the state is going to fund all of the capital outlay for the charter schools. And then it revises the virtual instruction programs so that they are valid for 2 years if they're approved by the state instead of 1. And then legal notices, just in general, allows us to publish once in the year in the newspaper that we're going to publish all of our legal notices on our website. And that actually, I believe, has been signed by the governor since this presentation was put together. Oh, I'm going backwards, that's why. Okay, so that was a general overview of all the big bills that passed this year. There were some other things that passed. HB 3, law enforcement allows law enforcement's children to participate in the school choice programs and also allows for some additional bonuses for them. Education opportunities for disabled veterans allows fee waivers. Restraint of students with disabilities. Last year they passed no restraints, and this year they said no mechanical restraints. And then I think there's a few residential picketing might be of interest because it prohibits anyone from picketing in front of your house. And then cybersecurity makes a public records exemption for any of our cybersecurity information. So were there any other bills that you heard about or any other questions that you had about the budget or anything? You've been excellent students today. Thank you very much for letting me do this.
Thank you, Wendy.
Ms. Jenkins, Mr. Pitts, if you'll please come forward. So the next item is a summary update for the school staffing allocation model. As the board, as we discussed at our most recent meeting, there was a recommendation that we modify our school allocation model to address certain areas. First and foremost is to address the disparity that exists between school levels that have similar enrollment. The second part of that, and I'll talk through the tiering. Oh, the whole team's coming up. Okay, fantastic. The second part of that is also addressing the staff-to-student ratio for critical service areas such as counselors, psychologists, social workers, and other positions that are needed on our campuses. That right now, our staff-to-student ratios are more than triple that of the national recommendation or the national average. And so especially as we're seeing more students returning to schools, there's a national conversation happening about students struggling with a variety of issues coming out of COVID that need to be addressed. And we're hearing a lot of concerns from classroom teachers about supports for students as well. So there's a prioritization there. And then beyond that, modifying our school allocation model to address other types of support positions, for example, front office staff and others that may be needed. One of the issues we find very frequently with payroll is that there are a lot of payroll mistakes because we don't necessarily have a dedicated finance person or bookkeeper at all of our elementary schools. It's a function, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Jenkins, Mr. Pitts, it's a function of the school principal secretary, and that's not the case traditionally at our secondary schools. And by virtue of that, some things get missed, and we overpay employees or we underpay employees, and then we have to remediate those issues. And so it is important for us to work to address those. So I'll turn it over to the team. There are a number of slides in here, just so I can give my team some guidance. A lot of these are just exemplars for you to review, but we'll go ahead and get started, and then there's a summary slide at the end. So please, Ms. Jenkins, Mr. Pitts, it's all yours.
The first couple of slides we talked about in our last work session, so it's just a recap. It shows how we do our current staffing. So we provide a staffing allocation to the schools. Then at the 8th day count, we true up based on enrollment. They do have an appeal option. Those appeals are reviewed by an appeals committee. We look at their scheduling, their enrollment, how the school is staffed, and what their reasoning for that appeal is. We also do an operating expense budget, which is calculated off of a formula. I brought up Mr. Bellows and Mr. Fout today because they both did a lot of research looking at how other school districts do their allocations. So that's what we've based the upcoming example on. This next slide we presented last time. It's an example of how we currently allocated our schools. We'll kind of go through there. That's our operating budget formula that we use. So here we start with our new proposed allocation model. So Mr. Hyde challenged us to look at a model that would not differentiate between school levels. So in the beginning, every school would get one principal, one AP, one principal secretary, one registrar, one finance secretary, which speaks to what he just told you about, 2 basic paras, a network manager, a clinic LPN, 1 media specialist, and a school counselor. In this initial view of the staffing allocation, we did not take into consideration special programs. We have IB, Cambridge Learning Centers that we'd need to take a deeper look at, and also our magnet schools. We currently have a little bit of a different allocation for those. It also doesn't reflect a change in teaching allocations because we do staff according to class size. And the plan utilizes the same ESE allocation model that we currently follow. This next slide shows you at what point a school would be able to appeal or would be given a new allocation. So we have it broken into school counselors, assistant principals, deans, 10-month secretaries, and then discretionary units, and also an art music PE teacher and a PE para. Keeping in mind with art and music and PE, once they obtain 2 paras, they can trade those positions in for 1 teacher if they prefer. We also do that with our ESOL model. So we'll just look at counselors, for example. When a school has an enrollment of 400, they could get an additional counselor at 8, at 12, at 16, 2,000, and 2,400. So that's how you read the graph.
So, Ms. Jenkins, just so I can clarify, if I may, so that, using your example of the school counselor at 400, that's the second counselor, so the student-to-staff ratio would be 1 to 200, correct?
Yes, sir.
And presently, we're at closer to 1 to 600 or 1 to 750, depending on the school level.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
So what Mr. Bellows and Mr. Fout did is they put together several examples of what our current allocation looks like with how it would look based on the new allocation. So we'll look at one of each. For this elementary school, everything, they would have 1 principal, 1 AP. The difference there is every position would be a 12-month, so we'd go the initial allocation. So we'd go from 1 AP 11-month to 1 AP 12-month. They would still maintain a principal secretary, but rather than 1 school secretary that could be used for any purpose, they would have a registrar and a finance secretary. We've started up monthly training with our school secretaries, and one thing that we discovered is they do different things at different schools. So in order to provide good support to them and ensure that they know their positions and are able to do them, we feel it's better to delineate into specific functions. The next grouping, we have, oh, that's okay. Everything remains the same for this example as you follow down. So the variance for a school with an enrollment of 316 would be an additional $86,000, almost 87. We'll flip through. As you can see, why we included different examples for this elementary school, The allocations are a little bit different. They're up to 724. So we look at that first chart that we showed you, and it changes some of these positions again. In this example, we are adding a dean. We're adding, the discretionary unit remains the same. We're also adding the finance secretary and the school secretary and changing the delineation in timeframes for the secretarial positions. And if you guys want to go through and look based on enrollment, this one shows 1,500 and the changes in regards to the plan. We included a K-8 since we have some of those. In the K-8, you can see that we, in our current plan, start out with a principal, a 12-month AP, an 11-month, two 11-month APs, but they're differentiated into AP1 and AP2, and then also a 10-month AP. In the new plan, we streamline a bit. We have a principal, one AP 12-month, and then 3 AP 11 months to provide a little bit more support and consistency. They both have the principal secretary, and then you see currently we have one school secretary 12-month, one 11-month, and 3 10-month. In the new plan, we break it out again to the registrar, the finance secretary, and then they would have 4 10-month. The reason why we give 10-month with enrollment is because they're just there to provide additional support while the students are there, and the other functions are static in the times that school is out. No, that's cool. We have a middle school next. So this one has an enrollment of 608. Again, we have the secretarial changes. You see immediate, they have 1 basic para. With our current model, they'd start with 2. They have a dean per our allocation, but based on the new allocation, they would not have a dean. Because everything is based on enrollment and consistency throughout all groups. So for this one, there's actually a savings. Some schools it would increase positions, some schools it would decrease positions.
Why did they lose a dean?
Based on their enrollment.
Because in this model, there's only 608 students. There's a principal and 2 assistant principals. There's more than
Okay.
enough staff to address that issue.
All right.
So this model addresses consistency throughout all schools and equity. You'll see, again, for 750 enrollment, there are similar changes. However, in this model, they do maintain their dean position due to the level of enrollment.
So basically, more kids gets a dean.
The last example shows 1,050 enrollment. Here we do have an increase. We have an additional basic para. We have an additional counselor, and we maintain the dean. And then you'll see where we have a teacher testing coordinator now. That becomes a discretionary unit that they can use as they see fit to best suit their needs.
And going back, Ms. Fortney, to your question, so yes, at some point, it no longer makes sense to have the assistant principal. It makes sense to have a dean. And deans remain within the instructional bargaining unit and are not, because the number of staff are not increasing, the number of administrators goes up typically for 2 reasons. Number one, academic program needs, student enrollment, and the supervision of other staff. And so for a small school, for example, to go to 750, another 150 students would not generate enough staff that it would make sense to hire another administrator for evaluation purposes. It makes more sense to supplement that with somebody who could supervise discipline.
Not having, removing a dean and adding an AP, I would imagine that position would primarily deal with discipline and other related concerns. Is that a true assumption on my part?
So in the first case of this, of the middle school model with the 608 students, they would essentially lose the dean
Right.
to, again, to create equity across all of our schools. However, in this case, you still have two other assistant principals who are there, one's an 11-month, one's a 12-month, who would then perform the functions of supervision and disciplining students. It's not uncommon for assistant principals to do that. But again, the staff number here is so low that where they would be spending more of their time on staff evaluations and classroom observations should not be adversely impacted. However, this could also be addressed if we found that there was a school that had some concerns or issues, as we have in the past, as we have this year. If it came through my office, for example, either through regional feedback to Mr. Green or through Mr. Butler to Mr. Green and then ultimately to me, we could then assign some additional administrative support in the role of a dean, but that would be based off need. This creates uniformity across all the schools, and then we could take other factors into consideration from there.
Yeah, I understand that. Thank you for clarifying that. And one of the principles would be a APC, correct?
At the middle school, yes, well, they would, API or APC, yes, ma'am. Assistant Principal of Instruction or Assistant Principal of Curriculum, and then the other one would serve as an APO, Assistant Principal of Operations.
I think my concern is making sure that if there is a school that is dealing with an unusual amount of behavior problems or whatever it may be, and we remove that dean position, that if they need support, that we are able to get some support there immediately
Yes, ma'am.
and not let situation get out of hand. So that would be my concern, making
ma'am.
sure that that would be a commitment that we would have in place from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
The final example for middle school is 1,447. So in this example, you see, again, the differences. We've streamlined the APs, principal secretary, finance secretary, added a para. They have 4 school counselors versus 3, and also they have 2 deans and 2 discretionary units versus 1 dean and 1 testing coordinator. And middle senior,
Ms. Miller, sorry.
The school counselors, which I think are much needed, will their job and duties be different per school? Because most of our counselors spend a lot of time data collection and meetings, and I think Ms. Fortney's always been a fan of, and many people, of more counseling and more guidance. So are they going to be the same, or it just depends on the need of the school?
It's going to vary somewhat based off the needs of the school and what types of programs and supports are needed at that campus in particular. But by adding additional counselors, largely you offset that burden on 1 or 2 individuals, and it's shared amongst the team. Counselors are always required to attend IEP meetings and 504s because they can speak best to the students' needs, as are some of their classroom teachers and others. So that is a core responsibility for them to attend that, and maintaining records on students is part of their core responsibilities as well. But I would see them spending less time in that because there'd be more staff to share the burden, because right now it's very disproportionate. For example, you have an elementary school with almost 1,200 kids that has 1 school counselor. So they're going to spend all of their day every day doing paperwork and not necessarily providing counseling services as they normally would.
I have a question. I don't know if this is appropriate time, but some of our high schools are LEAs. LEAs are on a teacher's schedule, so it's the same, I guess, no matter where you go. But some of these high schools, the one person is responsible for hundreds of IEPs, different than an elementary school. Have we ever, I don't know, in your experience in other districts, has there ever been anything done to either supplement pay for what they're doing or add support for those people? And I don't know how we would do it if they're all on the same salary schedule. I just know that our high schools are much larger, and I'm pleasantly surprised that they can even take that amount of work on.
Yeah, I haven't seen LEAs in schools in 7 years until I came back here. Quite
Okay.
honestly, when schools are staffed properly between counselors, school psychs, social workers, then that burden is evenly shared amongst all of them. It is not the sole responsibility of one individual, should not be the sole responsibility of a particular individual, especially one who may not be full-time on a campus. And so LEAs are is an ongoing conversation and a programmatic area that we're going to focus on right now.
I think that's, I think a shared responsibility is a great concept. I know that will be shifting the mindset and culture of the district. So I know all the LEAs will be glad to hear that, but I don't, you know, that would be changing direction from the principals that it's a shared responsibility.
Ms. Forden?
I can kind of speak to what Ms. Miller is saying, because as the teacher of the gifted, I had to do transitions from 5th grade to 6th grade, from 8th grade to 9th grade. And it took up my entire spring break. That's when I did that work. So there is a need, I believe, for the LEA, but it would have been nice had I had a little help as a classroom teacher, especially changing programs, not knowing, you know, just something to be aware of.
So, and I'll share similarly, I was in the same position you were in as a classroom teacher, and I had to do the gifted transitions and all those notes. However, my school was able to structure my schedule in a way that it did not interfere with my off-duty time. So respectfully, that's a scheduling issue, not a staffing issue. And the school should have been better prepared to provide you flexibility with that time and to provide relief through substitutes and others so that you would have those paperwork days in order to catch up. And there were times where my administration would provide the entire team with certain days so that we could work together to get all that documentation done during a traditional school day. So I don't know that that's...
But I'm just trying to put that out there.
Sure, that's a
as
shared experience, but
Right.
my experience was vastly different than yours. And what that speaks to, though, is better leadership, better organization, better supports, better scheduling. And it's not a reflection on the current staffing model.
No,
But,
yeah.
go ahead.
There's a
Mr.
lot of
Jenkins.
work. That's the bottom line.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, there is.
We have a middle senior example. You see that it loses the virtual education facilitator, which was a para, but that's replaced by 2 basic paras, one which could serve in that function. We have the same changes up top in administration that we've had previously. And in this example, due to enrollment, they have 1 dean versus 2, and also a discretionary unit rather than a testing coordinator. Our second middle senior example has an enrollment of 1,078. So as you can see with the increased enrollment, they have an additional assistant principal, which accounts for the cost increase. It is offset by 1 dean rather than 2. Our first high school example is an enrollment of 1,042. We have the same structure above. They have an additional assistant principal, 11-month. They do have the registrar of finance secretary and 2 additional 10-month secretaries due to enrollment, 2 basic paras versus 1 virtual education facilitator. The number of counselors is the same, 3, and then there's 1 dean versus 2 and a discretionary unit rather than the testing coordinator.
Ms. Forde?
I'm sorry. Are we calling the registrar secretary, is that basically the terminal operator?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Same
we
thing.
are transitioning that title. There's
Yeah, I know.
the title terminal operator is not reflective of their practices, and so they are transitioning formally to registrars.
Gotcha.
More
And-
importantly, student registrars.
Right. And then my other question is, have we discussed, or has it been thrown around, you and your team, about giving school counselors the option of going to a longer, like an 11-month, 12-month?
No.
No.
What has been discussed, in this process has actually served me very well, is providing a scheduled number of additional days based off the total number of counselors, and in our case right now, until we get to that place, based off the total number of students. And so essentially what you'd come up with is a ratio of additional days, supplemental days, that we could pay staff. And so let me give you an example. If there were 5 counselors who work at a high school, we would essentially give them potentially 50 extra days. That means every counselor could work an additional 10 days, or 2 counselors could each volunteer to work 25 days. But that would come with a work plan that must be approved by the building administrator, and there must be outcomes and deliverables that are shared. And so that time could be used either in the summer or over breaks. It could be used during spring break, it could be used in winter break, it could be used anytime the school's open, and they could provide a function to those students. And so that's the approach we've been at the table with PEA, having a conversation about is how do we extend that time? Because not everybody wants it, and not everybody feels that they need it.
Right.
But for us, it's important, because just to assume to move everyone to 11-month
Right.
without really
That's
getting
what I
a
meant also.
concrete plan as to what they would work on during that time doesn't make much sense to me. I think it makes more sense to provide flexibility for each individual, to make a determination as to whether or not they need that, to then justify the work to be done, and then that's how we pay them beyond their traditional contract. So that's the approach we're taking right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We move on to 1,421 enrollment at a high school. With that increased enrollment, they get an additional 10-month secretary. They do have the 2 basic paras, an additional school counselor, and an additional discretionary unit.
And some of this, because I know the questions will come up here in a few moments, because as we start to look at the history, in particular at high school, with our specialized programs and how programs were staffed previously. And then, so for example, we have a high school that has a strong IB program, right? And at some point, that program essentially operated as a school within a school. It had its own administration, it had a counselor, it had a secretarial unit, and it received a 0.5 AP. When that school was reabsorbed back into its sister high school, its original high school, it maintained those positions, which the problem with that, as we've been fighting to address throughout this year, is it leads to perception issues where other campuses now look at their FTE allocation and start to question, well, why is it they get those positions and we don't get those positions? And there's a belief that some schools are overstaffed, and they are correct. When we launch programs initially, we provide what the phrase that's been shared with me are attractor units. And so in order for a fledgling program to be successful, we need to make sure we have the right staff in the school. And then we guarantee the school over a specified number of years, we're gonna support these staff outside of your budget, outside of your FTE units, because we want you to grow the program. I think, quite honestly, we made very good steps this month or this year by moving several APs to 12-month assistant principals, essentially head of school or head of program, but very much like we talked about with the counselors, there's a new level of scrutiny and accountability that comes with that. You can't continue to have a program with 100 students in it and it's not growing. They are now required, as we talked about, they have to have an academic improvement plan or a program improvement plan, a PIP. They also have to document all of their meetings, that they must have at least 4 meetings a year with their own program advisory committees. They must be documented. They must have a quorum at those meetings. There's no longer we're not allowing those meetings to go unresolved where they just simply don't happen or just a handful of people meet. But more importantly, they're setting expectations. They're reviewing their recruitment policies. They must increase the number of students participating in their programs by aggressively going out to feeder schools and start drawing more students and families to their programs. They also have to retain more students. They have to look at the demographics of their program and target their recruitment based off those needs and areas as well. And so all of that's now coming into the fold by elevating them. There's an expectation and they're being held more accountable. This will all be part of their annual evaluation. As we also look forward, part of the issue that we have with those attractor units has been that they have persisted for long periods of time without any new enrollment. And so essentially, we continue to support 7, 12 additional positions at a school that is largely unjustified because the number of students attending the school are not there. And then that in turn has led to a belief, well, we deserve that because we have small classroom sizes as a result. That's why our kids are more successful. So we're putting our best and brightest kids in the smallest classrooms when we have other kids that are desperately in need of intervention and supports, and they're at class size cap classrooms. So we are working to address that. Those units will start to be phased out. Additionally, we had always intended to charge schools back. Ms. Jenkins, if you would take a moment, or Mr. Pitts, to explain that that at some point, these programs are supposed to become self-sufficient, either through FTE or other means. And so for the first time starting this next school year, we are starting to charge some of those positions against their fund balance on their campus, as we should have been doing all along. So this is, how do you create equity? You have to put the procedures and policies in place, and you have to hold programs accountable. And we are continuing to work through individual issues at each school and program area as we can, but this starts to rectify a lot of those long-standing inequities, especially when you compare school level to school level and school to school. It's going to take us a while. Again, it's not going to be a one-year fix, but it may take us a while. Could you explain how we charging back, either one of you? Yeah. And then, Ms. Miller, it's yours.
Thank you.
So the IB funds and ACE funds, they're restricted categorical. But we've just been charging the teachers and staff out of the regular general fund. And those programs have built up a good fund balance of somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5, $2 million. But we need to start charging those programs, the salaries to those programs, since they're picking up the additional FTE funding for those programs.
It was Ms. Miller and then Ms. Fields.
I just have a question, and it's not directly, it is indirectly related because it's another program. And Jason and I have talked about this in the past. Our transition programs, when done at the full potential they have, some of them now bring in money, that WBLE money, that was returning, instead of back into the transition side, it was returning to the general fund. And I think that we need to focus on growing those transition programs, creating more of those WBLE opportunities, and then returning those funds back to those units so they can grow. Because right now, we talked about it at one point 2 years ago, but I'm not sure where that fund, and it's nowhere near what you're collecting for these other programs, but it is funding that could be used to help grow those programs. Is it still going to general fund, do we know?
I'm not aware of that fund. Dr. Lutz?
It comes back to ESE as of this year. We fixed it. It was going to general fund, but it is now being directed back to ESE.
But it goes back into ESC, not back to the direct unit that created the dollars.
Correct. It goes into ESE.
And I think it needs to go back to just like you're doing with these other programs, to grow the actual programs that are creating the dollars.
We can definitely explore that. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Ms. Fields?
I understand the value of making sure that if there's surplus dollars in fund balance for the various schools, that we need to even the playing field. However, we have supported schools that sometimes did not have the FTE, did not have the resources to make ends meet, if I would say it like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we start having conversations like this, I am sure that staff will look in depth and make sure that whatever we do, that it is a gradual step, and that it will not jeopardize the ultimate goal of putting the students first. I hope that makes sense, because I want
It
to make
does.
sure.
Actually, I think, and it's a very valid point, and I appreciate you raising the concern, and let me reassure you and everyone else, including the community and anybody else watching this, that that is exactly what we're trying to do here. That by transitioning slowly, and I said that we'd start charging positions against those fund balances, that's what those funds were always intended to be used for. We made that known at the time, we just never did it. And so at this point, we are starting to do that, but it is a slow trickle. Although, additionally, for programs, they'll be placed, much like a school improvement plan, on a 3-year trajectory. So nothing will adversely impact them in years 1 or 2, so long as they're making steady improvements towards an ultimate goal and their plan. So it is important, and I think your clarification is accurate, that for programs that are new, for programs that don't necessarily have the beneficial enrollment, either because of their geographic location or other factors, yes, ma'am, those things will be taken into consideration so that no program will be harmed, but we have to keep pushing to grow those programs so that we can best respond in a strong fiduciary manner. Because one of our high schools, for example, is overstaffed by about 7.5 positions, which quite honestly, that's a considerable amount of money. that could easily go back into other classroom positions or support positions. And so what we've been trying to do throughout this year, we've implemented curriculum audits and scheduling audits. We haven't had those in a number of years. So we're actually looking at class sizes, we're looking at the number of classrooms, we're looking at all of those things, and, you know, making sure that we kind of tighten it. We can't create new positions and new opportunities and give raises if we don't first reflect on our current practices and make sure we're being the most efficient we can. However, in the same regard, we have to also make sure that we are honoring our commitment to our students and our families. So you have my assurance and the team's assurance that that's exactly what we're doing.
Thank you.
And when this
And
gets
then
drilled
these-
down at the individual school level for you, I'll provide that information for you so you'll see how that works. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask that, so thank you for that.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Wyatt.
That was one of the things I had to ask, so I appreciate that. As far as teaching units, this is extremely helpful and exactly what I was asking for when we talked on the phone the other day, so I appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am.
But as far as teaching units, will we see a breakdown of how many units for how many students? Will that be the same at elementary through high school?
It'll be the same based off their FTE and/or specific programmatic needs. So for example, a school that has self-contained units or itinerant units may be slightly staffed differently simply because of the needs and how those needs of those students can best be met. You will see a breakdown. At high school, it gets a little bit more complicated because it then becomes, how do we provide a breakdown programmatically? And I can talk
Right.
with the team about how we can best reflect that if we can. We have a lot of teachers, as you know, who teach across. They teach as part of the core for the regular high school, and then they teach one or two sections for the specialized program. So I'd have to work with the team a bit. I know we talked briefly on Friday. I grabbed the team one last time before they were walking out the door, especially about the attractor units. But you'll see we'll be able to show disparities where they exist and how we're going to address that over time.
Awesome. Thank you. That's the biggest question, I think, is just being able to see. It's, you know, we see our staffing plan every year, how it's traditionally come, but being able to see where the inequities are is difficult sometimes on paper, especially when we only see pieces of it. So I think that would be very helpful.
Well, we will
if
do our
can see
best, too,
that.
to explain them. So I think this gets back to Mrs. Field's point. If I make the conscious decision with the team to overstaff a school based off a need, whether it's we've seen a spike in discipline or we've seen this program's really not doing as well, they have declining enrollment, and their enrollment may not necessarily justify a full-time FTE, but we feel it's beneficial for the students to have more stability with a full-time FTE person there, then you'll have that justification as to why we made those decisions to staff the school that way. And I think that addresses in part both your question and Ms. Field's earlier question about how do we make sure that while we're trying to make everything equal across the board, that we're also making it equitable for our programs and our students and our communities. And I think that's the way we'll have to address that.
Awesome. And just one last question. So you have, obviously, looking at just some of these schools, some are additional funds, some would be less funds. Is this your proposal for next school year to go straight to this? And can we afford that?
And that, I love the head shaking over here. So the proposal right now would be, this would become part of the tiered, layered. So if I'm not sure what slide we're on. Jason, if you would go to the summary of next steps, thank you. So the district team at this point will begin to transition with the board's approval. The first thing would be to start to adjust current staffing to create equity across school levels and enroll based off enrollment and greater equity across those. So this ensures that schools with the same enrollment will have the same staffing options. We believe it's going to take us at least 2 years to fully accomplish that because, again, the total cost just to make these adjustments right now, if we were to try to implement all of these for the summer, came to 17 million, if I recall correctly. Yeah, okay. I want to make sure I didn't guess the wrong number. About $17 million. So it's going to take us some time to transition. And then in Tier 2, we'll begin to enhance other school allocations to create improved student-to-staff ratios for counselors, social workers, and school psych. So Tier 1 adjustments, you might see a handful of those begin this summer. A dean, a secretary, those types of things. And then others will occur through attrition. So if a principal secretary, or let me rephrase that, if we're looking at an elementary model, and one of those secretarial units were to retire, that might be the opportune time for us to make the adjustment to the new positions of a true finance person and a registrar. So we'll look at those and create a timeline for those as well. And then Tier 3 focuses on other positions such as deans. So deans were not a high priority for us unless it was an equity issue. So if there's an elementary school that has 800 kids and a middle school has 800 kids, the goal for us right now is to try and get the two of them as closely aligned as possible. But deans are outside of that. They're instructional unit, secretarial staff, bookkeepers, and anybody else who's not addressed in Tier 1 will be addressed at the end. But again, a lot of that's because I believe we can address that through attrition, higher salaries. While we always base our numbers off the average salary with benefits, some schools, for example, you get a 30-year veteran or 35-year veteran, you're cashing a significantly higher salary at that point. So there are some savings that we inherently occur or derive at that point as well. So starting this summer, if you give me, coming back in June 14th, I can provide a comprehensive summary of what adjustments we're making now for 22-23, and then which adjustments we would anticipate to make for 23-24, and then we continue to drill down from there.
Thanks. And can we get the updated presentation with that slide?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And then I promise this is the last question for real.
Go right ahead.
But so with going to moving, having someone just over finance or just over registrar, will we be cross-training other secretaries to understand those functions? So if somebody's out for a significant period of time with surgery or whatever it is, that there's not just nobody that knows how to do it in the school?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ms. Jenkins is already working on that. As she said, we are starting to pull secretarial staff from their campuses to provide better, more robust training. Part of that is errors are happening, but with respect, it's really not their fault. They haven't had the support and training. It's been a couple of years with COVID and a lot of disruptions, staff turnover. So it's time for us to get back to that and make sure that they all have all the basic information they need. Each one of these positions will have a core number of trainings that are respective to their roles and responsibilities. We call it a passport to success for each individual. And then beyond that, there'll be cross-training opportunities, because the benefit of cross-training is not just to fill in a void if someone were absent, but it's to create an opportunity for advancement as well. We don't want somebody being so pigeonholed in what they do that they're not a viable candidate for something else. But we also don't want to assume that time and seat equates to, so I've been a registrar for 20 years, I now want to be a principal secretary. And I mean no disrespect to anybody who's made this type of transition recently, but are they really ready? Do they have the skill set? Or are we just assuming, well, they've been in the organization that long, they should know? And so I'm a big believer in the micro-credentialing and the certification process, so that we know for a fact we're training people to make that next step and to be successful, more importantly, if they make that transition. So yes, they'll all be cross-trained and supported in that regard.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have that summary sheet that?
The summary of next steps?
Yes.
It was not included.
Okay.
I added that late last evening, but I will send out the updated PowerPoint presentation to the board. Thank you. The last one is the book options for parents and guardians. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the first option, but the opt-out. So beginning with the 22-23 school year, we're going to provide an electronic form for parents and guardians where they can choose to opt their child out of specific titles. The opt-out, even with the inclusion of an opt-in, is still required. As you know, 16 books were challenged. Of the 16, all 16 were retained. There were some adjustments. Even 2 of the books were not fully challenged, with everyone opting to retain those books. So there was 14 out of 16 that we're talking about with the opt-in. However, with the opt-out, there may be specific titles and or themes outside of that list that parents or guardians may have concerns with that they don't want their child to have access to. So the opt-out is important. This maintains roughly the same timeline, Ms. Miller. I know you had some concerns with August 1st. We moved it to August 15th based off some assurances that the team was able to provide me. Or again, they must complete it no later than 15 days following the student's enrollment and registration. With respect to anyone who fails, this will automatically default to their child having full access to all content at this time. So there's still a protection in place for families who may have an objection to certain materials. However, we do need to establish some rigorous timelines in order to ensure that we're protecting our staff and that we can do our due diligence to make sure all the information has been captured and in the right hands of our staff. So this is exactly what we talked about for 3 or 4 meetings, what the opt-out would look like. Now we can talk about the opt-in. So based off conversation at our most recent meeting, request was to look for an option for an opt-in. So it's the same electronic process. It would be on the same form. So they would have the opt-out section and they'd have the opt-in section. In this case, they would be able to provide their child with explicit access to any of the books that were challenged, saying, yes, my child may have access to Beloved, my child may have access to drama. These books would not be necessarily located with all the other instructional materials. That they may not be located immediately behind the counter. The media specialist and the principal will determine where to maintain the collection of those books. Please keep in mind that these books were very limited in their distribution. These are not countywide books. In certain instances, there's only one copy of the book and it's contained at one high school. So we're not talking about having to shelve multiple copies across our campuses. So again, very limited in their disbursement. But at this time, they would be kept behind in an alternate location, and only students who have parental permission would be allowed to access the materials in the school library. Books that have instructional relevance will also be addressed via permission slip. In keeping, so this is the third phase of this, in keeping with board policy, when it talks about controversial materials and other items, there is a permission slip. So at the secondary level in middle school and high school, parents will receive, as they do every year, the reading list for classes where the teacher will be supplementing the adopted curriculum with other library media or other literary resources. In keeping with our existing practice, because we do have existing policies and procedures as it relates to this, not because of the challenge of books, but we've always allowed parents and students to request an alternate reading assignment for their child. And so they could have an alternate reading assignment. It's important to note, though, that the alternative reading assignment that they're issued will still likely result in the same themes, the same type of topics and issues or conflicts that the teacher was seeking to address in the core curriculum, or excuse me, in the supplemental curriculum. So there might be, again, I'll use Beloved, which is part of the AP recommended reading list. If a family were to object to Beloved, they'd get a permission slip. They could opt their child out of that as well, but they could request an alternate assignment. It is ultimately the parent's responsibility to request, and the student's responsibility to request an alternative assignment. The burden does not default to our staff. So when we send this home, it'll be sent home electronically. It'll also be provided at open house and orientation when all the students show up to meet their teachers, and that way this information will be readily available. So if the parent wants to request an alternate assignment, they may. But again, the ultimate responsibility falls on the parent and or guardian to do so. It is not the responsibility of this teacher to initiate that. So as we said, 6 through 12 English Language Arts syllabus will include a list of books to be incorporated and outline the parents' guardians' opportunities to review each title and subsequently request an alternate assignment. The syllabus will also outline the process to request an alternate assignment. Parents will be informed of these titles no later than the school's scheduled back-to-school night. Titles may be posted online for the school's website for families that cannot or will not attend a back-to-school orientation, or the teacher can share them via email with the parents of their students in their class. So that again, 3 options that we'll have in place if the board is okay with these: opt out, opt in, and then again continuing with our current practice of a permission slip as it relates to the assigned reading for a classroom. Ms. Fordy.
I am not for an opt-in at all. I think that puts an unnecessary burden on kids that might need access for that. It's hard enough to get some parents involved if they don't want kids to read books and have them do the opt-out. We already have policy in place for that. Why are we putting more restrictions on a parent and a kid's right to check out a book? I don't get it.
Ms. Fields?
I think what my concern is the assumption that the parents have access to online availability, and that if they don't do anything, that it automatically forfeits to whatever it is that we have in place. And understanding that a lot of parents might not come to meetings, or they might not come to the orientation because they could be working, or there might be other reasons why. So how do we make sure that those parents are getting what they need to get? I know it's not our responsibility 100%, but I think we need to do the best that we can to communicate to the parents so that they will know what their options are.
Yeah, I think you raise a valid point, and part of that is, again, beginning now in June and July, or more importantly in July, excuse me, we will ramp up our communication to families via phone messages, emails, other communications, mail home materials if need be, to inform families of this issue and to inform families of what options they have. If they don't have access to a computer at home, they can do so through a public library or other areas. It's incredibly rare that someone can't access the internet from their phone. My understanding is all of the content in the application that's being developed would be readily accessible from a phone in order for them to submit that documentation to us. If they needed to come to school, our schools are open 5 days a week, as you know, during normal hours for families to come in if they need be to provide that assistance as well. But I think it's incumbent upon us to communicate to parents and convey to them the importance of this topic and what their options are. And unfortunately, I could explore with the team what a paper-based option would be. The problem with the paper-based option, especially as it relates to the opt-in, that's easier to do than the opt-out. If a parent were to say, I want to opt out, there's just no way for me to send home a comprehensive list of all the books in their child's campus. I mean, it'd be huge packets we'd have to mail home to families to give them that access. And have them then check the box, and it would then become incumbent upon one of our staff to enter all that data by hand. So I do believe that if we can communicate this and over-communicate this to families, again, make them aware of the importance of this option for them, and then at the end of the day, it's their responsibility.
I understand that, and I respect that, but I still have concerns about that.
Yes, ma'am.
And I looked, and that attachment is not on the agenda, correct?
It was not, no,
So
ma'am.
if you can make sure that we
Yes, ma'am.
get that, I would really appreciate it, because I want to look at it a little bit more in depth.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Wilson.
You know, since the inception of this issue, the folks who have indicated that they want full access all the time have done so based on the premise that this is limiting students' access to certain themes and certain genres. That has never been the case, and I know I can say that and folks won't believe it if they don't want to, but the folks that approached me said from the beginning, this is not about themes and genres. This is about content that young people shouldn't have access to, content that they wouldn't have access to if they went to the movies, for example. Parents would have the ability to restrict their access to the content. It's about sodomy, it's about bestiality, it's about rape, and it's about verbiage that is inappropriate for certain age groups. And so I think that's why it's so important to have an opt-in, so that in the same way that they can restrict their access to their children from seeing that kind of explicit content, having nothing to do with themes or genres whatsoever, then we extend that same option for books. And there really, how is there a difference between books and a movie? There really isn't. It is the same issue. So I think that's why it's important to have an opt-in.
Ms. Miller?
I just have a couple of questions. First, as a board member, I'd like to return to policy, because this could, we still have books coming in that people may have issues with. So we need to go back to the policy that we've already written, that these will be handled at the site-based, because like you said, some of these books are not available. So how will a parent know? Because we need to put this back to the parents and their responsibility. If they don't know what books are there that are going to need to be requested, how will we alert them? There's 16 books that have been questioned district-wide. Your school has 2 of them. Like, are they going to know which ones are in special settings? Or are they going to, for their school site?
Yeah, so their selection form would only have titles related to their particular school.
Okay. And I'd like to know more about what we're requiring of the librarians or the people running the library. I want to avoid the, VHS video store behind the curtain. I just think that's a bad look. I don't know how we're planning to do it. It's just going to call attention to books that haven't really been given much attention. So I'd like to hear about that. I would like for us to return this back to the schools for their own learning communities to decide if further books, like, I don't want to continue this process. I already have people saying, well, if you're going to do this, you need to look at this. The kids are waiting for us to determine some really significant issues, and books that are never checked out are difficult for me to keep spending time on. And the list will keep growing depending on what your preferences are. So I want to make sure the parents are included, and it's their responsibility to find out how that process will work, and then how our policy will move forward with questioning content of libraries.
There's been no change to policy. The only reason we crafted a different approach to this was the actual nature of the complaint. That was it. There's a difference. When the board policy and practice was first adopted, there was never an assumption that there would be an allegation that we were in violation of statute, let alone 3. That is not the premise of how the board developed a policy in the past, or the district developed this policy. The board allowed for books to be challenged based off specific titles. It was never related to themes. It was never related to anything else. It was specific to a particular book. I shared the 30-year history with the board of the books that have been challenged. Some have been removed, some have not. But again, they were individual titles by individual Polk County residents, or family members, or even employees. There was an employee who challenged one of our books. One of our librarians challenged a book a number of years ago, and that book was successfully removed from the library at that time. So this was a reaction, and we developed and our process, with all due respect, not only mirrored our existing district policy, but I would say was actually better than our existing district policy in how we included members of the community, so that an argument could not be made that the books in their review and whatever decisions were made, positive or negative, as far as retention and or removal, did not reflect the community standard. I think, quite honestly, our committees very much so did just that. And so the district process was based off the assumption that there were potentially violations of 3 statutes that could result in felony charges against employees for issuing books. We had a great deal of uncertainty. And so at the time, we agreed to address those books in their totality, but the board policy remains in place. Additional book challenges, if there are any, and there will always be a challenge at some point, will be addressed at the individual school level. I think we've proven, and there's been enough case studies across the state, that there is no criminality here. Multiple school districts have addressed this. This issue has been a challenge in multiple school districts, only to have law enforcement conduct a long and in-depth review of the criminality behind these, only to find that there was none, or is none, and that this is a school district issue. And so, quite honestly, that's where we are. So as far as the overall policy, the policy hasn't changed. People can always petition or request a book to be challenged based off its content or its premise. That's been our history. We return to that. As it relates to staff, staff will just do 2 things, as they do now. They will check to see if one list, they will basically default to the database that shows what the parents have filled out, either the opt-in or opt-out, and then they would then use that information to check out the book to the student in Destiny. As you know, we talked with Destiny Follett extensively. Initially, we were very happy with the fact that they were going to allow us and work with us to incorporate this within their own system. They then subsequently retreated from that position. And so it does create an additional burden on my staff, but not on school staff. Because my staff are the ones that have to develop the process, have to make sure it communicates well with schools. But the burden, as far as the librarian or media specialist or media para, when they're checking out books, is simply looking up in the system, does the student have any flagged materials? If yes, I can't check that out to that student without parental consent. So
I just want to mention that there's been a lot of disinformation about this process, and the fact that there was alleged, we were, allegedly violating statute, and I think from the beginning we knew we weren't. That I don't want that. That's not something that a board should chase, allegations of violating statute. So I want to be clear on that. And with the parents being in control of this, with there's, I think you said 2 books that the committee unanimously said were
retain.
not an issue. Are they
Correct.
going to be returned, or are we keeping all of them in some seclusion?
They would, right now, they would be returned because there was no challenge to them.
So it'll be 14 books that you would have to
Correct.
request,
Correct.
and the parents will have notification. I just needed to hear a little bit more about the process of I have a parent call and say, my child's allowed to access your library books. How do they do that if it's a topic, one of the 14?
The parent will indicate their preference. Parent can always change their preference.
So they would
during
go
this-
into the library and say, I want to see Beloved, and there's a checklist somewhere of that child able to look at to view that book. Like the process of the student checking this book out that is not going to be on the shelf. I just want to know how that will happen.
Correct.
Okay.
It's not on the shelf. It'll either be retained in the library, behind a desk, or in an office, or in a storage room, wherever they choose to retain that book. And I think it's important that as you pointed out, there are a lot of false assumptions. There is very much a false narrative that children are flocking to our libraries. Number one, our libraries are not heavily utilized. There should be no mistake there. I wish that they were. But that students are going there and pulling these books off the shelves and reading them while they're in the media center. It's a fallacy. It's not happening. The checkout history for these books alone shows these books are not a high interest and are in high demand. The issue at hand right now is how do we provide opportunities for parents, and I do believe that parents should have a choice. I believe that parents should be well informed. And I think by placing this burden on families, it engages them differently. Good, bad, or indifferent, it forces parents to be part of the narrative, and many have not. And you've heard me say this, and I use this phrase all the time, and it's not just a catchphrase, but how do you move people from being passengers in education to being partners in education? Some of it's an ask, some of it's a requirement. You can't simply default to responsibility all the time and just assume. You have to have a voice in your child's education. And so whether it's taking the extra step to allow your child to have access to that book, and let's be very clear, every child in our school system has access to these materials through any public library. There are no restrictions on what they can check out at that public library. And so there are no issues there with students lacking access, and they have far more access on their phones to content than ever before. So again, we chased the issue initially, and while I don't like that phrase, the board, we were in agreement as to how to address this. I brought proposals forward, so this was not just a knee-jerk reaction. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknowns, and at the end of the day, the question became, do we spend $1 million in litigation, or do we try to address this in a fair and consistent manner? I believe the path we chose was the best path. In fact, I believe so strongly in that, and I think it's been affirmed because the team can attest to how many calls we get from other school districts in the state of Florida asking to now replicate our process because they liked how we did it. And, you know, without that uncertainty, it's not my job to expose the district, more importantly our employees, to litigation and or fear of criminality. And so I believe we did it the best way possible. But again, it reverts back to its traditional course of action. Parents have options now. They can opt out. If they don't opt out of content, then it automatically defaults to them having access to the complete library with the exception of the opt-in books. Again, not books that were in high demand ever. Look at their checkout history. What I wanted to protect by making sure we clarified here through the permission slip is that some of those books are used instructionally. This gets back to a comment that Ms. Cunningham made several meetings ago, that there is instructional relevance for several of those books. And parents need to understand that even in the absence, so let me give you a case scenario. Let's say that I as a parent do not opt my child in and allow my child to read Beloved in the media center. However, it comes home as part of the assigned reading list. If I grant permission for the assigned reading list, that supersedes the library because my child's not getting that copy of the book through the library anyways, he's getting it through a class. So at the end of the day, you can still, the permission slip addresses the materials that provide instructional value and or relevance. However, if I choose to opt out, then my child can get an alternate assignment along the same themes. So parents need to understand the theme itself will not go away. The verbiage, the manner in which the author expresses himself or herself will change. The narrative slightly changes, obviously the storyline changes, but the core theme and the conflict contained within the novel are all the same. And because that's what we're trying to challenge students with, is and make them go through the process of thinking, that metacognitive approach, thinking about their thinking, being reflective readers, are they building that comprehension strategy? Because really that's what we're preparing them for the AP exam and other exams.
Well,
so
that's-
hopefully I answered all your questions.
Well, that's one thing I want to make sure people understand. If the book's going to be in the classroom, and your child's in an AP classroom, we're not policing what's in that. We're not going to police what's in a book bag of your peer. And second of all, when another group comes, because I'm afraid this may set precedents, that even when we get possible allegations of statute, these will all now be handled at the site level. If you bring a list of 500 books, you will go to your school. If they have the 500 books, which I'm sure they won't, we handle that in the learning community at the site. And another question, I'm glad you mentioned, we have other board members who may have opinions on this. Were they not able to Zoom in today?
They were not.
Thank you.
They were not. Ms. Fields and then Ms. Fortney?
I think it's going to be very confusing for parents trying to determine what opting out versus opting in means. So I think that we're going to really have to do an in-depth campaign to ensure that they know exactly what that entails. I would say that I'm a little bit concerned by having the two options. Because I just think the parents, and I keep going back to the parents, because I know in my work outside of the school district, that some parents feel comfortable with whatever they have before them, and some just don't feel comfortable, and they need guidance, and they need to have a sense of direction in order to make a good decision, because they love their kids. They might not have the knowledge to do what is ultimately best for them, but at the end of the day, they want what is best for them. So I don't know how that look, and I don't know how we achieve it, but I think it's very important.
Yes, ma'am. There may be an opportunity for us to partner with local libraries. There may be an opportunity for us to put together a video series to help explain it to families and walk them through the process. I mean, those are all things that we can explore. Because again, the goal is to have a high participation rate. I still believe that with just an opt-out option, we'll see very little participation. And I think, and I said it before, and I stand behind this, I actually think that to a certain extent, that's a reflection on how many people were actually concerned with this issue altogether. Mm-hmm. But there are others who don't accept that as being a possibility or being real. But let me explore with the team how we can best support our parents to make sure they feel comfortable making a decision and why they should make a decision, if any decision needs to be made. Our goal is not to lead them to a decision. Our goal is to support them in their ability to do so. I hear you. So let me explore options with the team, and I'd be more than happy to share an update at the June meeting as well.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Wyatt.
Ms. Fortney, I think, was first.
Okay. Ms. Fortney.
You know, it's going to be 16 more books next time. They'll go behind. 30 more the next time. They'll go behind the counter. I opted in. Now I want to opt out. I just see a big can of worms. And policy says opt out only, correct? I don't understand why we are even providing an opt-in for, I just don't get it. If they can go to a public library, they don't have to do it. Why are we adding more burden, more paper trails, more everything when they have the power for their child, not my child, not Sarah Beth's child, not Ms. Fields' child, but for their child to opt out? That's all.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Wyatt.
They don't even have to go outside of their library. They can actually
Yeah.
have a public library book delivered to their library to then check out. But I will not support anything that has opt-in. I'm in favor of having the opt-out option where parents can select what books they don't want their child to read, but I will not support anything with an opt-in option. I do, however, think that any books that we're requiring at the high school level for students to read in class as part of an assignment, that there should be a permission slip just to make sure parents know what they're reading if we're requiring it. But for library books that they can choose on their own to check out, I will not support opt-in. So, and it sounds like there's some support for that on the board, so I don't know if we need to get
I
a
need a
consensus that we don't want to
consensus.
explore that anymore.
But Mr. Wilson stepped out, so we'll have to wait for Mr. Wilson to return. But I'd like to ask for consensus amongst the board as to your position on inclusion. Again, I included the opt-in based off a request at the last meeting, and my conversation with several board members leading up to that meeting. So if the board believes that the opt-out and inclusion of the permission slip is sufficient, I am more than happy to move forward with those two. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question. Students can request books out of our public libraries to be delivered to us in our libraries?
Yes, ma'am.
So
If
what
there's
is-
not an electronic version available, they may request materials through the public library. We have an intergovernmental agreement with public libraries.
Unless the parent opts out from that agreement.
So
Correct.
you're avoiding an opt-in if they're requesting it from a library?
Correct.
If students request it through the public library, that's outside of our control.
There is a distinction legally as
Correct.
between what is a public library and a media center maintained at the school. So, and I'm sure the superintendent, he has done a very very good explanation of a very difficult subject that is wrought with potential nuances and things that, frankly, I applaud you and your staff for coming up with something that I think threads the needle, if you will. And I hate to put it that way, but I believe that under the circumstances that we face, of course, board members can decide their consensus or their viewpoints however they determine is appropriate, but I'm not certain that it is something that is a board level. I mean, we're not talking about policy changes, I don't believe.
Well, if we're adding opt-in, then we
No,
are.
the change would be in that regard. So that's why I did bring it back to the
Okay.
board for discussion. So the board does not have a role in selection and adoption of materials at the
Right,
school level. They
right.
do for core curriculum.
Okay.
And that's ultimately where responsibility is. Even though recent legislation starts to bleed over into library materials, which I strongly continue to support are instructional supports and not instructional core valued materials. However, given the nature of this, and I want to be respectful of the board because the opt-in was brought up by the board, and again, in conversation with board members, that this would be a change in policy.
I see. Well, at any point, when the appropriate dialogue would occur for that public meeting or that public action,
Correct.
then I guess we can have further conversation.
But what, yes, Ms. Fields?
That was what I was getting ready to say. If the policy says opt out, and we're talking about adding an opt-in piece, then that has to be presented for the board to vote on at a public hearing.
Yeah, I should be more specific too. The opt-out policy that currently exists allows parents to opt out of assigned materials, not necessarily instructional materials but we've had a long-standing unwritten policy that allows parents to go into the media center materials and select certain topics and or themes that they did not want their child to have access to. That is not in board policy. That is just an internal practice that we've had. So there is some board policy interwoven in here. However, there are other board policies like I shared. There's, and I should have included that in the presentation. I'll go back and add it if need be. But there's controversial materials that the board has explicit expectations set up, that how do we communicate that to parents, and then, and we do provide, I believe there is some reference in board policy to alternative assignments as well, as there should be, and I would be surprised if there isn't, because even in the curriculum area of human growth and development, we always provide an opt-out and an alternative assignment for students, and that's required in statute as well. So there are multiple references to opting out within board policy, although albeit not explicitly stated here. For media materials, it's more aligned to materials that are assigned to students for reading. And that's where the permission slip would come in for several of these books. But I think there's enough of a connection and reiterance of that phrase and terminology that it's understood. And it's been part of our practice for a number of years, that it's just something I believe needs to come back to the board for a policy decision in June. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Miller?
That was my question. When something's inferred, to change policy, we couldn't do that, right? You couldn't do that today.
No, there's no vote on this today. It's just, the board asked me to come back with what an opt-in would look like, and so that's what I've crafted for you here. I would have to work with Ms. Dodge to revise the current board policy and show what the opt-out, opt-in would be, because we'd want to be explicit in the whole process.
So you could move forward with an opt-out, you can move forward to get ready for August with an opt-out.
Correct.
Okay.
And I think, just to put a further point on the matter, I think that, assuming that there is a policy move afoot, that it would probably not come to fruition on June 14th, because you'd have to
Advertise.
You have to
Correct.
ask for permission to advertise, which is normal. And so this would be something further down, the summer perhaps. But-
June discussion, July approval,
Yeah,
and not implementation.
but I think, I don't want to say anything more. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, Superintendent, and that is that the practice that your staff is
Precedence, yes, sir.
is going to employ and utilize is thus and such, and you're letting the board know.
Correct.
Now, whether or not that requires official board action is perhaps a more further discussion may need to be had on that particular issue. Because I think we agree that the board policy that's in effect today is the board policy and is working
Correct.
or is implemented. But there may be a practice.
There is a practice, and again, as I shared, there's multiple references to opt-out and opt-out procedures and policies in board policies, at least 2 board policies, as I recall from my research over the last few weeks. So I'll cite those for the board and allow them to reference, and I'll work with Ms. Dodge to see, develop a timeline, should we bring language for revision to existing policy and practice. Thank you, sir, for the support.
Yeah.
So if I may ask for a consensus amongst the board, Ms. White, I don't know if you want to call the question or if we need to have the attorney call the question.
This is a workshop, a work session meeting where you don't take any action, so
Correct.
consensus would be simply a verbal, which you're not bound by necessarily, in terms of, position, official or otherwise.
I just think we want to make sure we can give you direction, and I don't want you exploring the opt-in policy when it sounds like there's not at least 4 votes to support that. So,
At this point, I get the distinct impression there are not 4 votes to support the opt-in.
so if we can just each go through and say whether or not we would support the opt-in for library books, I guess.
So why don't we go through all 3? So if we could, we just go, I don't know, I'm trying to recall, Ms. Wyatt, last time when we did a consensus. I think there's 3 questions: the permission slip, the opt-out, and the opt-in. And so I would ask each board member to tell me, of the 3, which do they support?
So
Can you put that back up, please?
Yes, ma'am.
can you also send that to us when you have a second?
Absolutely.
I'm a visual learner.
Yes, ma'am.
So I would not support the opt-in. However, I will support the opt-out and a permission slip for any books used in classrooms.
Ms. Miller or Ms. Fortney? Sorry.
Opt-out and permission slip only.
Ms. Miller?
I've learned new information today that I don't think I knew ahead of time about access that students can access, which is statute, which is different, that you can access library books through the libraries to our schools. I just think that we have a policy, changing policy that will be voided if students chose to do that. I don't know, other than making policy for public pleasure, I don't know that it's, if we make policy, I want to make sure that it's valid and can be held up when there's staff understands it and it could happen. But if I'm a librarian and there's books behind my desk that kids have to opt in for, but the library sends a book over and says it goes to the student, you've just voided the entire process. So I'm not sure I need to create a third process. I need time on this, Mr. Hyde.
Okay.
And that was basically why I had said that I wanted to get the document. I have mixed feelings, and I think that having 2 options would be very confusing for parents. Again, always looking for parents, because they're the ones that's going to have to make that decision. So if I had to give a sense of direction today, it would be the opt-out with the permission slip,
Okay.
if. But again, I'm like Ms. Miller. I think that I need a little bit more information, what you have there,
Yes, ma'am.
to review and chew on it and make
Yes.
sure that I'm understanding.
I'll also provide the board with an update on the policies that I've referenced today.
Correct.
So that you can reflect on those, and I'll work with Ms. Dodge. Mr. McNaughton, if you would find out when the IGA was signed with the library, public libraries. So that would have come before the board for approval, just in reference. It's an intergovernmental agreement. It is not uncommon. Don't believe I've ever been in a school district where that's not been allowed. Part of that was to eliminate barriers for students to gain access to instructional materials. School districts readily embraced that simply because it more than tripled the number of books and titles that were available to our students. But they do operate under a very different legal standard than public schools do. And parents have to opt in. There is a requirement there for parents' participation. So they're already acknowledging that their child may have access and that we can't in any way filter that content. So it's just something to be aware of.
And we've
Yes, ma'am.
probably been doing that for a long time.
This is a little bit of a hybrid, sort of. The book is reposed in a public library that gets brought over to the media center through some intergovernmental agreement. That then changes, I mean, in transit, it then becomes a different kind of book in a legal sense.
Correct.
So I think that's where I'm not certain legally there's any difference once it is reposed in our media center. Even though it may be borrowed from a public library.
Right.
And may be requested, it still has to get disseminated from our media center to that child, correct?
Correct.
So in other words, the child doesn't go over to the public library and take the book out. The child takes the book out while they're in our school.
If it's a physical copy,
If
yes.
it's a physical copy, yeah.
But
So-
largely, they're now digital copies, which complicates the conversation even
Yeah,
further.
so I mean, yeah.
Yes,
So
sir.
I believe it was implemented 2019-2020 school year is when they first started doing it. And the students have access that they can actually have it delivered to their house. But part of it was that they could have it delivered to the school as well. So I don't know that they're necessarily, because they don't have to pick it up in the library, I don't think. I'm not 100% sure on that. So,
I don't have information.
but it was
today,
implemented just before COVID.
Ms. Miller and then Mr. Wilson.
I just want to make sure day one of school, or by day 15, parents have the right to go in and opt out of genres, and this isn't including the 14 books. You can opt out of hundreds of books by genre, title.
We will
Okay.
not guarantee genre at this time.
Okay, so they can, if parents are very, very concerned that within 15 days, their high schooler, because there's disinformation that these schools are elementary schools. I've had to deal with that. So as a high schooler, if I do not want my child to see this book within the first 15 days of school, I must select the opt-out. I'm opting him out of these 14 titles.
No,
Okay, explain how that'll work.
because it's only the titles that are at your child's school.
Oh,
So
so,
for
okay.
example, it's perfectly normal.
Okay,
The book that we saw on a trifold with the photos.
Right.
Cartoonish kind of in nature, exists at one school in the entire school district. It exists at Haines City High School. Hasn't been checked out.
now you've
as-
told all the students at Haines City High School to go get the book.
I haven't, but, so that book would be reflected on that list for that school. So if the
Okay.
book is not in circulation at a current school,
Okay.
there's no reason to include it.
Okay, so that's important for parents because I'm trying to, what you said, and this is what we need to do as a parent. I want the choice. I want to give parents the choice. As Ms. Fields has mentioned, listen, I want every parent to be 100% involved in their kids' education. And we struggle with that. So I need for parents to have a clear message that if I'm a Haines City High School parent, within the first 15 days of school, I can go in and choose the title, so my child will not be able to see that at school. So we're still giving the parent the option and putting it back in the parent's hands to be responsible for what their child is selecting to check out. And I think that was the interest from the very beginning, parent responsibility, and that's what I want to provide them. I think what's been convoluted is we have policy that would have to be changed to do things differently. And now that the public library access, I want to see that same book, but I'm at Winter Haven High School. I can download it on my phone from the public library. So that, I mean, I think we need to make sure we're putting out the right information, because as of this past weekend, we have people believing that that book's available in elementary schools.
Correct. But we've addressed that numerous times,
We
and the
have, and
book
I don't
list
know how
has
to
been
fix that.
FOIA'd numerous times.
Where's public relations? No, I don't know how you fix that, other than just keep telling the truth and to help disseminate correct information.
Mr. Wilson, I saw your hand up.
Well, I hear Ms. Fortney, and I feel the same way on the opposite side of the spectrum. I can't understand it on any level. I mean, we heard somebody read one of those passages here. We all heard it. We know what it says. And we're okay with a middle school child reading that, or even a freshman in high school. It makes no sense. I don't understand it on any level. I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me. And that's what I'm talking about, passages, specific passages. I mean, if the authors rewrote those passages, they're not going to, but if they did, I have no problem with the books. It's those passages that are so vile. So we have those books segregated in our public libraries. Nobody's ever said we should ban them. No one's ever said we should take them out of our society or out of our public libraries. So they're segregated in our public libraries, and if a parent wants their child to have access to it, they give them permission. That's what the opt-in is, and I think that's spot on. That's the way it should be. They're not in our libraries, so they can go pick one up and read it during lunch or any other time. And even if only a few kids do it and they're impacted by that, why? Why would we be okay with that on any level? So that is opt-in. That's what opt-in is. The parent says, okay, you can have access to it. That's fine. They've granted their child access to it. I'm saying we should do that in our libraries. Actually, I'm saying we should send those books over to the public library and let them get them from the public library. I don't even think it should be in our libraries, frankly, but they're there. So that's why I believe in an opt-in. And if it's easier for you, Superintendent Hyde, to use the permission slip than the opt-out, then I'm fine with that too, whatever you suggest, but I'm still in favor of the opt-in for that reason. And I think saying that they're in our public libraries makes my case, frankly.
Okay.
And that they can be ordered over by the parent.
I'll reach out to our remaining two board member colleagues and have conversations with them, and obviously I'll have conversations with any other board member who has questions or follow-up to this, and I will bring something back in June. You'll have something from me well before the meeting. I'll say that.
So, Mr. Hyde,
Ms. Fields.
I have something completely different.
Yes, ma'am.
At our last board meeting, we spent a lot of time at the beginning of the work session talking about the district staffing organizational chart. And a day or so before, we got some additional names of upgrades and promotions.
Okay.
And I was under the impression that that additional list was going to come before us for the board meeting today, and it's not on the agenda. So my question is, when are we going to see that and have discussion on it? And then if it's not today, why are we having a board meeting with just minutes, 2 sets of minutes and naming of a building for someone? Are you understanding my question?
I am. So the board already approved the reorg. The board voted and approved that. There were 3 phases, as we discussed. There were existing positions that were modified, existing position and then restructuring, reorganization, regionals and other positions that we added the truancy officers. We had good discussions through most of those. And so then the board took action at the last meeting. So the only remaining thing before the board today is to allow me to take action on school allocation models. And so that was the intent behind today, was to ensure that the board was able to give me that information so that I could start working with HR to start transitioning to that new plan.
And I think that for me, I can't speak for the other board members, I think that for me, the focus was on the board position. And that's why I voted against the district staffing plan. And it's not noted in the minutes as to why I said nay, but that's the reason why. And I actually would like to have that in the minutes to show why I voted against that district staffing plan.
Yes, ma'am. If I recall correctly, I'll have to check. Yes, ma'am, we can
It's
absolutely
not,
include that.
it's not there.
Yes, I was making reference, I apologize, as to whether or not you voiced your opposition to the entirety of the staffing plan, which is not my recollection.
I didn't,
You-
because
you-
I didn't
You
know.
voiced concerns with one particular position.
Correct.
Within there, and I'll make sure we note that, so that you weren't necessarily averse to the entire staffing plan, or the reorg plan, but you had a concern in particular as to one particular position, as I recall.
Right, and I even had tried to see if I could pull that one position out to vote on the entire plan, and was told that that could not happen. So I just wanted to be understood that I did not realize that that last piece was a part of the plan that was voted on and approved by the majority of the board, because I don't remember it being at the top of the list. It must have been at the end of the list,
Okay.
is what I'm saying. So now I know. So my question is now, and I don't know that it even matters, if we only have minutes and one other item, why are we having a meeting today?
Because there were some other items that we had, and we felt the need to have a meeting at the end. If there's no need for a meeting, we wanted to get the two naming conventions, or excuse me, building renaming done. You and I spoke in particular about one. We realized there was a conflict for the family involved, because today is officially the last day for employees, so Sybil was not able to be here today. She was going to try and get here by 10 or 10:30 to be here for the naming, but we agreed to move it to June 14th. We did pull the allocation model, the school allocation model, off of the agenda for today, because that was initially what was on there for approval. But I wasn't sure where we were going to be at with this level of specificity, and it seems like today we were able to address those issues for the board. And so if there's a comfort amongst the board, we can make a motion to amend the agenda, if that's still allowed, and we could still have that. So the goal for today was to keep getting this information out before the board, continue to address your questions, but also get some movement. Ms. Wyatt and others expressed concern that if we were changing the school allocation model, we needed to do so in a timeline that would allow HR to begin posting those positions and let us start hiring those people almost as quickly as possible. So that was the intent behind today's meeting.
Well, thank you, because I was a little bit confused on
Yes, ma'am. The last thing I want to do is waste anybody's time.
I agree.
Okay. Madam Chair, that concludes the superintendent's report for today in workshop.
Thank you. And we will go through the agenda, which I think we pretty much already have. So we have the two sets of minutes. Apologize, wrong one.
There is one amendment, if it's not already reflected on here. The naming of the freshman building at Kathleen High School will be moved back to June 14th to ensure that the family is present when we do that.
Thank you. It appears that is
The work session meeting closed and then open a regular board meeting?
not yet,
Special-
because we're
okay.
going through the, we just go through the agenda
Gotcha.
first to make sure there's no
Thank you.
questions. Do we want to take a vote on approving the direction for the staffing plan, so you can start posting those
Yes, ma'am.
positions?
I would very much appreciate that.
So would that motion be to approve the staffing plan as presented during work session?
Yes, ma'am.
And that will be an action agenda item, correct?
Correct. And then on June
Okay.
14th, I'll bring the formal multi-year focus with costs associated, so that you see how we're doing that.
Okay, thank you. And then board member comments.
The minutes, I would like to have it reflected on why my vote was nay for the district staffing plan, and that's not in the minutes.
Okay. I don't, typically that's not put in the minutes under Robert's Rules of Orders, so I don't know
Well,
if
if it's
you
not
all.
going to be in the minutes,
have-
it needs to be in the work session. I demand it.
Okay. We can, okay, so how, can you do that between meetings? Okay,
And I'd like to have comments. I think that as a board member, I have a right to ask whatever I want to ask, and I should be respected to have that like everybody else. In the past, we've always had detailed minutes, and we've drifted from that, for whatever the reasons may be, Robert Rules of Order, whatever. And the only way that one can know what actually occurs in our meetings now is by going to the meeting video footage to see it. That's the only way we can know what, or the public can know. And so we spend a lot of time talking about different things, but when we look at the minutes, it's like we didn't really spend any time. So I respect the fact that sometimes we might not agree, but I also respect the fact that we can agree to disagree. And when I make a request, I would just really appreciate being respected enough to have my request honored. And it's nothing, to me, difficult about having a statement added to minutes saying why my comments, why my vote was a nay.
Thank you. My question was just to staff to make sure that was possible, because Board Docs has changed how the minutes are done. So that was, I just wasn't sure if it was a
You
access
referenced
that they
Robert
have.
Rules of
So,
Order, so I didn't know what that was all about.
well, that's because that follows how Robert's Rules is done. So I just wanted to make sure that we had the ability to do that easily between meetings. All right. Any other comments for the work session?
Mr. Wilson had his hand up a minute ago, but
Well, I mean, I'm a little confused by this conversation. I mean, regardless of what Board Docs does or doesn't, if someone wants something in the minutes, it goes in the minutes. It's just that simple, and that is Robert's Rules of Order. So I'm a little confused about why we would be hesitant to include that. And we've had this discussion before when it comes to minutes, and there has been some hesitation in the past about including certain things in minutes, but I mean, if someone wishes to have something added, it should be.
My question was just to see if it could be done in 5 minutes
It
before
has
the
to
next
be-
meeting,
well,
or if
you-
we
you-
needed to
you
wait
can-
and
I mean, you
approve
can
them
include
at
it
the
as,
following meeting.
You know, as an amendment to the minutes, and it doesn't have to actually go in there just now. It can go in there later.
Ms.
I
Miller.
just have a comment that, I was here I remember when we kind of changed that, and I know that my comments weren't being reflected the most accurately when we were doing details. But yes, if anyone was to ask, I hope that we could put an asterisk or, add that. But overall, the way that we're doing minutes is because that is usually how they're done in these size meetings. And multiple occasions, I went back when we were doing very detailed, she said this and he said this, and it just wasn't accurate because there's no way anybody could, unless we had a stenographer, there would be no way to do that. So thank you for adding when we can, because I think that's very important for board members to do. But detailed minutes weren't accurate, and I think they need to be. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Mr. Wilson?
And I agree with Ms. Miller. That was something of a challenge in the past, so I think at a higher level is more relevant. But certainly if someone requests to have something added, I think that should be as well.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Ms. Fields?
I'll say one other thing. I agree, and I think with comments from board members, with it being so much, it could be convoluted and could be misunderstood. But for simple motions and stuff, I didn't really see that as being a problem in the past. Those comments were primarily correct and accurate.
Thank you, Ms. Fields. Any further comments for work session? All right, and we will take a 10-minute recess while they reset the videos. Or sorry, not a recess. We're adjourning this meeting. We'll reconvene.